Hello, I'm joined by Pox Populi. We're going to talk about the movie Braveheart, and I'm really looking forward to this. You're very welcome, Pox Populi.
Hello, thanks for having me back on your show.
Okay, so we'll get into this movie from 1995, and it was directed by Mel Gibson, and I think there were a few other people involved as well. The screenplay was written by, funnily enough, a guy named Randall Wallace, and the music was by James Horner. Now, I have to say, I really do like the soundtrack, and last weekend I listened to the full soundtrack. So, what are your initial thoughts of this film from the very beginning, Pox Populi?
Well, I will say right at the beginning that this is one of my favorite films. I've watched it over dozens of times. I probably watch it once every 2 years. You mentioned the score. I think it's one of the best cinematic scores. I've also listened to it just for pleasure on many occasions, the whole film score. It is important to note that the film is wildly historically inaccurate at times. So I do recognize that. Just get that out of the way. But I think it's important just to talk about the film and the story it portrays as its own, just sort of as a standalone work of art and a sort of historical representation. It sort of adds to the legend of Wallace. And you mentioned the screenwriter, Randall Wallace. It's funny how this film was born, because so I remember when I had Braveheart on VHS in the 90s, and it was such a long film that it was actually put onto two separate VHS tapes, and you had to watch it on two separate ones. And at the end there was some like bonus stuff, and I remember watching an interview with Randall Wallace, and the way the film came about was because he was on holiday in Scotland, and he saw a statue of William Wallace, and because he saw that they shared the same surname, he asked the tour guide, hold on, can you, because Randall Wallace is an American, so he asked the tour guide, can you tell me who this man is that has my last name? And according to Randall Wallace, the Scottish tour guide says, oh, well, this is our greatest hero. And the tour guide starts to explain just some of the story of William Wallace, and Randall Wallace was so inspired by this story that he decided to start writing a screenplay for it. And that's where this film comes from.
Yeah, I see that it says it's based on The Wallace by Blind Harry, and it's supposedly a poem by the 15th century Scottish, it says Macar, or poet, Blind Harry. So
yeah, there's a lot of, so for example, the whole bit with William Wallace and his wife, which we'll get into, which is one of the key elements of this film, and something that the screenwriter and also Mel Gibson also talked about this, is they really did rely a lot on Blind Harry's story, especially the part about the wife, and they also sort of heightened the importance about the wife, which we'll get into, and that comes from Blind Harry's version. In other accounts of William Wallace, we don't know if he was married or not. So a lot of some of the the characters and some events do come from the Blind Harry account.
Okay, so if we kick off the film, young William Wallace, I guess he's about 8 or 9 years of age. He loses his father and his brother. So he loses his two role models, and he becomes an orphan because I think his mother is already dead. And before his father and his brother die, he sees dead bodies hanging in a barn or something like this. So I guess that would have been very traumatic for a child to witness. Before his father goes off and his brother, I can't remember how this works out. They're going to negotiate. Is it something like that, or are they going off to battle?
No. So the negotiation is the first bit. So in the first bit, we see the young William Wallace. He's just sort of working on a farm. They live in a sort of peat moss cottage in the Scottish Highlands, which is again a little bit of an inaccuracy, because Wallace was actually quite, in real life, he was of rather high status in society. He was kind of a noble, actually, or the son of a noble family. But in the film, he's portrayed as a humble farmer. And what happens is, that scene where there's the hanging bodies, that is true. Edward Longshanks, the King of England, did deceive Scottish nobles who he invited to he invited them under the premise of a negotiation, because the Scottish clans were bickering over who should be the rightful king of Scotland. And it might seem strange to us that they did this, especially if you look at, the film Braveheart and other films, Rob Roy, for example, or if you just know the history of relations between England and Scotland. It seems strange that the nobles would do this. But what they did was, to help them resolve their internal conflict, they asked Edward, the King of England, to sort of arbitrate over the decision of who should be the rightful king of Scotland. And so then, as time goes on, Edward, who is quite a ruthless character both in the film and in real life, he was very ruthless, and he did have this sort of almost genocidal hatred to the I guess you call them the Celts. Celt isn't really an ethnicity; it's more like a linguistic group. But the non-Anglo-Saxon population of Great Britain, he did seem to really hate them, and so he deceived the Scottish nobles to come to this meeting, and when they all arrived, he detained them all and had them all hanged, and that's really did happen. And so in the film, it's portrayed in the way that we see that Wallace's father and brother go off to this negotiation, and they survive, or I guess maybe they heard about it and they went to go check and see what had happened, and they open the doors of this barn, and there's all the I guess in the film they depicted as sort of like the clansmen, the clan leaders, and they're all hanging, and Wallace, against his father's wishes, snuck along, and he sees all the bodies hanging too. And then this is what inspires in the film. This is what inspires then the other clansmen to fight back. They can't allow this to happen. Edward, the King of England, has just massacred a whole bunch of Scottish chieftains, and so of course they have to fight back. They have to respond, and so that's when we see William Wallace's brother and father go off to sort of fight back against this great insult and injury.
This is where the young William Wallace is sitting on his father's horse. When the father comes out, he says, "Where do you think you're going?"
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, "I'm going with you. I'm going to fight." And the father has to take him off the horse. And young William Wallace says, "I can fight." And then the father says, I know you can fight, but it's our wits that make us men." So there is this wisdom, from the adult males in this film. And likewise, when the uncle comes after the funeral, he's also kind of very wise, very practical. And it's amazing to see how little the Scots had in terms of rights. So, for example, at the funeral, they're playing tunes from bagpipes.
Outlawed tunes on outlawed pipes.
Exactly. You've taken the words right out of my mouth. Exactly. Yeah. So even at a funeral service, it's dictated by the English. What sort of music you can play and what sort of music you can play, or if you can play music, you obviously can't use bagpipes. So it's quite brutal. And when Wallace comes back, so we should just mention that I really like this part where the uncle is very cold. He's not a complete asshole. He's a nice guy, but he's very, very cold. He's not in any way maternal. And I think he grabs young William Wallace's head and he kind of turns his face and says, "You have the look of your mother." So
yeah, when he arrives, he's a bit of an eerie character when he first. He's missing an eye. He's got like a sort of one eye you can see very well, and the other looks like it might have been cut out in a battle. He's got a scar over his eye, and his eye is kind of like glassed over. He's played brilliantly by the actor. I think it's Brian Cox is the name. Great actor. And yeah, he shows up, and you think he's going to be a bit of a nasty uncle, but yeah, you're right. In the end, he's just very pragmatic, and he has very few scenes, but in them he just speaks words of wisdom and just sort of expresses sort of Spartan mentality that he imparts to Wallace.
He says to him that they're going to go away, and young Wallace doesn't want to leave his village. And he says, very matter-of-factly, he says, "You didn't want your father to die, but it happened." So he pulls no punches, and he also tells him that he's going to teach him Latin, because young Wallace, he doesn't understand anything that's being said at the funeral because it's all in Latin. So he's going to bring him away to Europe. He's going to bring him away to the continent and educate him. And then we have the return of William Wallace, played by Mel Gibson. He comes to his village. Now, this was very fascinating because I get the feeling that in the village, they don't completely recognize him, obviously enough, but you get the feeling that the people there are aware that he's one of them, even though they don't recognize him. And he has to ingratiate himself by throwing stones. And this is another thing. The English have stopped the Scots from using conventional weapons. So the only weapons they're allowed to use are rocks and stones. So
yeah, there's some interesting parts of the film where we notice that the very first part, a scene that I remember even from the very first time I saw Braveheart when I was a very small boy, this stood out to me. And the first hint we get that the Scots aren't allowed to keep weapons is when we see William's father go off to respond to the murder of all those chieftains. And William's father pulls his sword out from under the thatched roof of their cottage, where he has his sword hidden because he's not allowed to keep a sword. So that's one very important detail, which I really liked about the film. Now, the film is a bit chronologically all messed up. Like, they're wearing kilts about maybe 500 years too soon. They weren't wearing kilts at this time. And, was it that Scottish music was outlawed during the invasion and occupation of Edward the First time, or did that happen later? And things like this. But it is true that wherever the English went, they sort of would do the same thing. They did this in Wales. They did this in Ireland. They would outlaw the indigenous language. They would outlaw certain indigenous practices, and they would outlaw, obviously, the right to bear arms. You can say was, of course, something that you can expect. So I like that the film did play on that that he has to hide his sword under his roof, and they can only use like stones and slingshots as their primary weapons that they train with. And like the music at the funeral and that sort of thing, that it's outlawed tunes. I think also the film doesn't get into it, and Mel Gibson is obviously a very devout Catholic, so I'm sure he wouldn't get into this. But I always saw it too as like that. Those are their sort of pagan, pre-Christian traditions. They had the Latin funeral, they had the Roman Catholic funeral, and then at night they come out with the bagpipes and the torches, and it's a bit more pagan, although the film doesn't really get into that. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how they portrayed some of the things that the English were prohibiting some of the traditions and some of the freedoms that the English had banned, had prohibited the Scottish from continuing. And so yeah, it's very interesting there, that bit about the weapons too. So yeah, then you have the William Wallace comes back, and Mel Gibson actually was nervous to play the role. He wanted to direct the film, but he wasn't sure if he should play the role because he thought he was too old. And he does kind of look like, in his mid to late 30s, which is quite old for, the historical, factual story. And so, yeah, he comes back to the clan, and he does look, he looks healthy and young, and, but he does look like he's aged quite a lot. He's definitely not a 10-year-old boy. But then he sees his childhood friend, which we had seen from an opening scene, and he challenges him to a strength of men competition, in which his friend Seamus is going to crush him with a huge boulder, and William just sort of says, "Okay, I'll give you a shot. You can throw your boulder at me," and then he just picks up a small little stone and uses that instead, and he throws it at his friend and gets him right between the eyes. And yeah, I think it's a nice scene. It's another one of those scenes too where you see them sort of engaging in pre-Christian traditions. They're all sort of dancing, and I think it's actually a wedding, isn't it? This is the wedding scene where a member of the clan is getting married.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think he arrives in the middle of a wedding, and we'll actually get into that, because it should be said that the English soldiers, they're everywhere. They're like walking CCTV cameras. Like they're just everywhere. And even in this wedding scene, they're kind of there on the outskirts looking in. And
yeah, it's very much occupied territory.
Everyone is being watched. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's an occupied country, and it would be like this in many occasions throughout history. If this was Roman occupied Britain, you'd have the same thing. You'd have the indigenous Britons walking around living their daily lives, but there'd be Roman soldiers everywhere. And of course, the English and Scottish, they share an island, they share a border. So these people have long history together. And yeah, you definitely see lots of English soldiers. You see the fortress in the background at one point. And so yeah, they would be everywhere. And another thing, so just going back to the wedding, is that when you can see sort of, I guess maybe even like Pictish traditions, pagan traditions, the people are wearing headdresses and flowery headdresses and animal headdresses, horns and stuff like that, and they're all dancing around like what looks like to be like a sort of like a maypole type thing. So the film is maybe not getting it exactly correct, but I did appreciate the detail of at least trying to show that the Scottish had some pre-Christian traditions, which even into the 13th century they were still maintaining, when you would have celebrations like a wedding or things like that.
It would be like the Irish wake. This is a pre-Christian tradition, and it was frowned upon by the Catholic Church, but they could never eradicate it. The Irish wake, the idea of putting drinking whiskey with the corpse, and then leaving the bottle at the feet of the corpse and all that. So I should just say that Primonoctis has been initiated, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here from Longshanks. Perhaps it's time to reinstitute an old custom. Grant them Primonoctis, first night. When any common girl inhabiting their lands is married, our lords shall have sexual rights to her on the night of her wedding. That should fetch just the kind of lords we want in Scotland. So this is after it has been discussed about the loyalty of the lords in Scotland. And it's quite comical the way Longshanks says the problem with Scotland is it's full of Scots.
Yep.
And I can imagine today, a massive NGO or corporation saying, the problem with France is there are too many French people. We need to change that. And he does say if we can't,
my friend, I've got something for you here because I did want to talk about this. I knew this would come up. It's such a great line. And the actor who plays Edward I. I should have looked up his name. He's a great actor. He died a few years ago, I think. There's so many great actors in this film, and the guy who plays Edward Longshanks.
His name is Patrick McGoohan.
Yes, that was it. Yep, Patrick McGoohan. The way he delivers that line is just fantastic. The trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. But here I've got this for you. This is from the 19th of January of this year, from the Scottish Herald. Neil Mackay's big read. So this is the name of the writer for this op-ed piece, Neil Mackay. Quote, "Mass migration is coming, and the future of Scotland is Asian," says leading migration expert Dr. Parag Khanna. And the article continues with this category, opening preamble. "The West will undergo brownification," Khanna believes. "If Asian youth represent the majority of world youth and the majority of world migrants, they also represent the majority of future mummies and daddies. We'll see an ever higher proportion of the world's children with brown complexions and less with white complexions. You can't refute that or do anything about it. It's all part of the beautiful, deep tide of history and demographics." And I shared this on my Telegram, and I just put the caption, "The trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. They just want to breed us out." And here we see it right here in current year. Oh, the trouble with Europe is just it's too European. The future is mixed. The future is brown. We've got to mix. It's all part of the beautiful tide of history. And that line is just, I've used it so many times at just changing, the nationality. That the trouble with France is that it's full of French. We've got to breed these Frenchies out. The trouble with Italy is that it's full of Italians. We've got to get rid of these Italians. Nothing really seems to have changed this. And, it must be said that Primonoctis, it's highly doubtful that it was ever used during the medieval era. And this is an invention in the film. Edward Longshanks didn't implement this policy in Scotland. But I like how it's used in the film. I think it's a good artistic license, use of artistic license that they put this here, because it is so shocking to a modern audience. It is so cruel. It is so it is a bit, even creepy. Like, what? Oh, could you imagine? Could you imagine you get married and then some English noble rides in with a retinue of soldiers, and they just take your wife from you, and now he gets to, bed her before you even, It's like that's pretty creepy and would definitely make modern audiences shudder. So I like that they took that license, but also I just liked how they show that that you can use demographics and breeding as a tool of invasion and of defeating your enemy. And that line from Longshanks is just so perfect, and we can still use it today. Oh, it's just, you can just see that's how the left, if you want to use that term, that's how the open borders, George Soros type leftists see native European peoples. We are a thorn in their side. We're a trouble to them. The trouble with these European countries is that they're just full of Europeans. This is, we've got to do something about this. We've got to breed them out. We've got to brownification these countries. That we've seen it before, and too with protesters or left-wing marchers with their signs that say, "Lol, your grandkids are going to be brown. You can't stop this. We can replace you." So yeah, I really like how this film in 1995 shows that that this is an arrow that's in the quiver of occupiers and invaders.
In a way, there is a Primonoctis going on in modern advertising. So,
Yes.
All these advertisements, very few white people, and if there are, they are generally homosexuals, or you might have a beautiful blonde woman with an African.
Oh yeah,
and
the typical black male, white female advertising.
Yeah, this is a form of Primonoctis in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to humiliate you to humiliate you, to make you lose faith in your, in your future, in your people. So, yeah, and as you said, this is in terms of animal husbandry and all the rest. This is a great way of conquering a country by changing the ethnic component of the country. And I think he says something, Longshanks says something like, if we can't get them out, we'll breed.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I was just going to say that, yep, he's not doing this just to, just to bring in some Anglo-Saxon admixture to the Scotch demos. No, he says, if we can't drive them out, we'll breed them out. He wants to eliminate the Scottish people so that he can conquer their land and their resources and obtain more power for his dynasty. And so, yeah, he's not just doing this because, it's just a thing about demography and, having, it's not because of the votes, he needs to get more of the migrant vote. No, he's doing this because he wants to get rid of these people, drive them out any way possible. And so he can conquer their land and basically annex it to the English territory.
Also, it's in relation to the commoners. He's not going after the nobles. He's going after the commoners. And likewise, what's happening in Europe, it's really the working class that's affected mostly by this mass migration, because they then have to compete for resources. They have to compete for housing, for jobs, for anything really.
Yeah, because, when you see the film, and again, just to clarify, this didn't happen in this time period. This might have happened in other times during like ancient Rome, for example. This didn't happen during the English war with Scotland during the time of William Wallace. But in the film, it's interesting that we don't really know how high of social status the wedding, the bridal couple have. We just see that the local village is celebrating a wedding. It's between a man and a woman that we don't really know much about. The man kind of becomes not a main character, but he has a few lines later on, and he partakes in some of the battles, and he's with William throughout like the first part of their war effort. I think he dies in battle actually later. And it's really beautiful though. They get married, everyone's happy. William returns home. He has the little contest with his old friend Seamus, and then in rides the noble, the commander of the garrison, and his soldiers. And of course, this provokes a pretty aggressive reaction, especially from the husband. And then the camera goes into slow motion. The beautiful music from James Horner comes in, and the bride walks sort of like an angel. She just sort of floats through the men who are, swords drawn, knives are at each other's throats. It's about to get pretty messy. And she just slowly removes the blades from, I think the soldiers have a knife to her husband's throat because he's, trying to fight these English bastards who are going to take his wife. And she just sort of gently pulls the knife away, and she gives herself up. She gives herself away in order to, stop the bloodshed or stop any potential bloodshed. She makes a huge sacrifice. She surrenders herself to the enemy, to this English noble who gets to, claim rights over her. And so, yeah, you mentioned the humiliation of it. And also you get a sense that just like we feel today, the husband and the men, the Scottish men of this clan, they're just so impotent. They can't do anything about it. They have no weapons. They have no armor. What can they do against, this noble and his 50 soldiers? There's nothing they can do. And, like you mentioned, Uncle Argyle says, and also William's father said, it's our wits that make us men. Uncle Argyle teaches William to use his head before he teaches him to use a sword. You have to keep your wits about you. So yes, of course, it's a situation where your emotions are riding high. It's a very emotional moment. It's infuriating. But if you look at William, for example, he keeps his head down. He understands that, this is a horrible thing that's happening, but he keeps his head down. You can see that he's empathizing with his people. I think he makes eye contact with the woman, and then later he makes eye contact with Murren, his future wife, and they both sort of through their eyes, through their eye contact, you can see that they're communicating that this is horrible, and also, this could happen to us. This could happen to any couple that falls in love and wants to get married. That they'll have to surrender their bride to some English lord, and it's horrible. It's just, you can just tell that this is a horrible scene. But I love the way the film, in the midst of this horror and very sort of just disgusting practice, they play this beautiful music, and the bride sort of just surrenders herself like this floating, angelic, fairy-like figure to the enemy. I thought it was a beautiful scene. It's beautiful despite what it's depicting.
Yeah, it's a very nice scene, very powerful. I should say as well that it reminds me a bit of the grooming gangs in England. So where you have women, very young women being, their virginity is broken by foreigners. And there's nothing really the English can do, because, the system that's at play is not going to do anything to help, the English girls and the English people. So it's a very similar situation in ways that this sort of thing can happen and be normalized. Quite tragic. I should say that we might get on to the tryst between William Wallace and Murren. Now, I'll just say that when I was watching this recently, I'd forgotten how roguish William Wallace is, because he doesn't look for Murren's parents' consent. He takes her out riding against their will in a drizzle. And I was thinking about this, how would you look at this sort of behavior? If you're an adult and some guy turns up in the evening and takes away your daughter without your permission, you're kind of going against the order, the natural order. But Wallace can kind of do this because, as I say, he's a rogue, and as we'd say in Ireland, he's a likable rogue. It's a very nice, I have to say, it's a very nice setting where they go off riding into the evening. He does
when when it's raining, when he first asked Murren out on a date, basically. It's really cute, because again, like, the actors do look a bit too old for the part. So we're supposed to imagine them maybe a lot younger than they are. But you have to think it's the 1200s. It's the Scottish Highlands. They're not going to go out for martinis and a film, So what can they do? And again, I think the ownership of a horse kind of, maybe we can imagine that gives Wallace a bit of status. He has a horse, he can go out riding, and it's raining, and he comes to the home of Murren and her parents. She still lives with her parents, like, of course she would, of course, and he does ask, would you mind if I take Murren out riding? And they're like, but it's raining. And then Murren says, oh, it's only drizzling. And she just runs out of the door. She just runs through the door and jumps on the horse. So Wallace does kind of ask for permission, but it's Murren who takes the initiative and just says, don't worry about it. See you. Bye, Mom. Bye, Dad. I'm going off with this roguish man. And they just go riding off into, and I think, the film is just, the landscapes are beautiful. I think the film was mostly shot in Northern Ireland, actually, not in Scotland. But the landscapes are very similar, obviously. And it's just so beautiful. They're often these like green pastures and riding through the forest, and it looks so idyllic and wonderful. And you just want to go with them and be with them in this sort of free, wild, Northern European environment. At least for me, it evokes much of that. So yeah, very, very good.
A lot of it was shot in Ireland. The second time I think he comes to Murren's house, he's I think he's throwing stones.
Yeah, that time he's not invited. No.
Yeah.
Because the next day so we see them riding off into the Scottish Highlands and the hills and everything. And it's sort of like their first date. And they're just talking about how did you recognize me? Because we have to remember too that at the funeral of William's brother and father, a little 10-year-old Murren comes to William and offers him a Scottish thistle as the to empathize with him as a tear is rolling down his cheek. And so they knew each other from childhood. And so when William comes back, they recognize each other. And of course, they've had this. We know that they must have had some sort of friendship or bond from childhood. And so they talk about that and they reminisce. And then the next day, we see William is sort of patching up the old family farmhouse that, of course, has been abandoned since the death of his only living relatives, his brother and father. And of course, he's not been in Scotland, so the family farmhouse has sort of fallen into disrepair. And some men of the clan ride up to, I think, as Seamus's father, who's played by, his last name is Cosmo, is the actor's name. And they ask him, "We've come to fetch you to a meeting." And William says, "What kind of meeting?" "The secret kind. It's a meeting about, again, like the kind of meeting that led to his father's death, the kind of meeting of, we got to do something about the English." And William says, basically, count me out of it. I don't want to be involved in any of this stuff. And someone says, Seamus's father says to William, "Your father was a fighter and a patriot." And William says, "I know who my father was, but I'm here to just, build a farm and, God willing, build a family." And then Murren's father says, "Do you mean what you said? Did you mean that when you said you want to stay out of it and you just want to raise a family?" And William says, "Yes, I do mean it." And Murren's father says, "If you can prove that to me, you can court my daughter." And then William says, "Well, didn't I just prove it by not going to the meeting, this troublesome, meeting that you guys are cooking up this plot to get revenge on the English or do something with the English?" And Murren's father says, basically, "No, not yet. You've got to prove that you don't want any trouble, that you're going to stay out of this, stay out of the fight, stay out of any sort of rebellion." And a bit of foreshadowing, I guess, in that scene.
Gibson played a similar character in The Patriot, and there was a similar situation where everyone was telling him, "Come on, let's fight the English." And he's kind of like, "No, I'm a widower. I have to look after my kids." And it's only really when it comes to his door, that's when he's gonna react. I should say as well, like, this is something we have lost in our multicultural hellholes. The idea that you might not know someone, but your parents or grandparents will know their parents and grandparents, and a sort of diagnosis or whatever can be given in regard to their character, their personality. So, for example, if the great grandfather was a terrible man for drink, and the grandfather it's kind of presumed that the young fellow will be of a similar disposition. So there was a thing when in rural places, if you started courting, let's say, a woman, her parents could find out who your people were. Likewise, your people could find out who her people were, and you could more or less find out where the family's okay. Was there serious mental illness in the family? Did they have a terrible temper tantrum? You could more or less figure out. Obviously, environment.
I wouldn't even say that it's because of multiculturalism that we've lost it. I would say that's more because of modernity and just people moving into ever increasingly larger city populations, urban populations. Because in the small sort of, I guess you could say it's a town, which actually got a population that's quite high, but the town itself that I live in Spain is physically small. You can walk from one end to the other in about 20 minutes. And most people live in a very sort of, centralized area of the town. And a lot of people do know everyone else. So even though the population might be in the thousands, everyone knows each other. And there is still a bit of that where, like, you know, I've had it even said to me, hey, are you going out with that girl? Be careful. Like, her family is full of like schizophrenics, you know, be careful. So there is still that here in, you know, it's a rural small town in the south of Spain. But of course, if you were to go into a bigger city, if you were to go into a capital, if you were to go into a big city, you know, then everyone's a stranger. Everyone's from somewhere else. You're not going to have that. So yeah, I think it's a bit of the multicultural thing, of course. You know, we're all sort of living in increasingly deracinated places. And then also just because of modernity and urbanization, urban sprawl, increasingly bigger populations, urbanized populations, we're losing that clanship, you know, that connection of, you know, I know you, I knew your father was a good man, so I think you might be a good man. So you can, I have good sensations about you going out with my daughter, or the opposite, you know, your father or your mother, you know, they were crazy, or they were cheats or something like that. So stay away, which can be a double-edged sword, I guess, too, if like you're a good person, but you have a, you know, a bad reputation because of the sins of your fathers. So yeah, very interesting that you to notice that.
We should move on to the wedding and all the rest. Now they get married at nighttime. I guess it's a midnight ceremony, and this is also a very nice thing. They're having a secret wedding. She hasn't even told her parents, as far as I know. When I watched this, I was noticing how Wallace, he's full of sexual lust now. He's full of sexual lust, and he more or less gets her into trouble, because in the market square or whatever, he's standing right beside her in front of the soldiers, and he's nagging at her to come and meet him tonight, and she's saying, oh, I can't tonight. She's trying to be careful, but he's like, yes, you can, come on, tonight. And one of the soldiers sees this interaction going on, and he tells the other soldiers to look lively. I think we've got one here. And yeah, it's horrible how they execute her. They slit her throat in front of everyone as well. They want everyone to get the message. If you have any secret weddings, you try to keep it away from us, we'll find out, and you know, this will be the consequence. So what did you make of this?
Yeah, so this is the story that comes from us from Blind Harry. We don't know if it's 100% factual, but there's another account that also incorporated the Blind Harry story. There's an author named G.A. Henty who wrote a story about William Wallace as well, Wallace and the Bruce, and they incorporate this as well. I like this story. I like this, whether it's an embellishment or not. I think it's necessary, and Randall Wallace as well also mentions this, why it's necessary. Because if it's just a story about William fighting the English because he just wants to fight the English, it doesn't have that much appeal. It doesn't have that much depth. But if you add that he's doing this to avenge his slain wife, that adds a lot more depth to it. That adds another dimension to Wallace's character and his motivations. Because it's not just that the English killed Murren because she had a secret wedding. So, as you said, they get married, and then we don't know how much time passes. Could be the next day. It could be a few weeks. But yeah, they didn't tell anyone. No one knows. Because why did they have a secret wedding? Because if the wedding had been made public, then an English lord would have had rights, sexual rights, to Murren. So they got married in secret. They didn't tell anyone. And so we don't know how much time passes from the secret midnight wedding and the next scene where we see Murren is doing some, you know, work on the family farm in the village, and Wallace shows up and he's like saying, when can I see you again? When can we meet? And that's when you said, you know, the soldiers noticed this. And the soldiers try to rape Murren. William saves her. He beats up some of the soldiers and puts her on a horse, and tries to get her to flee to safety. And he also then has to hightail it because now the soldiers are trying to kill him. Unfortunately, Murrin doesn't make it out of the village. Some of the soldiers, actually, I think they kill the horse she's riding on and then capture her. And so she's executed mainly so that they can get Wallace to come back, because they want him, because he's the guy that actually roughed up the soldiers, and that's intolerable. That cannot be allowed. So they want to provoke him to returning, so that they can capture him and punish him. And the way they figure of doing that is, we'll just kill this woman that he was talking to, and also that they surmise is his wife, because they have exchanged like pieces of cloth with their tartan on it, which is also anachronistic. That they weren't wearing kilts at that time. They weren't wearing tartan at that time, but whatever. Now, this is in the Blind Harry story as well, that what Blind Harry writes and what was in the G.A. Henty story is also that Wallace was already rebelling against the English. And so the English captured his wife and kill her in order to get Wallace to, fall into a trap, basically. Make him angry, make him upset, so that he'll fall into a trap. In the film, Wallace hasn't started his rebellion yet, but he has roughed up some English soldiers. So that's why they execute his wife. Very, very. It's like it happens in a blink of an eye. It's very unceremonious. They just put her up against a post, and like you said, they cut her throat. And then the commander of the garrison says, "Now let's see if this scrapper will come to me." So you get the impression that they did this so that Wallace would come back. And then, then there's just one of the greatest scenes in the film when Wallace returns on horseback into the lion's den. And you just know there's just so much tension. It's so well done. He comes in, it's all in slow motion. He's riding on horseback. He puts his hands up to show that he's unarmed, and his face is haggard. He knows what's happened. He knows they've just killed his wife, and he was clearly in love with her. I mean, it was like I said, they're meant to be much younger than the actors are. Clearly young love, and now it's been taken from him, and he just rides into the village. It looks like he's going to give himself up. The English soldiers approach. They take his horse by the reins. And then all of a sudden, he reaches behind, and he's got this big sort of like Scottish Afro type hairstyle, this big like 90s hairstyle, and then hidden behind his hair, he's got this mace on a chain, and he just whacks the face off this English soldier, the closest one, and then all hell breaks loose. There's a lot to talk about in the scene. Because I just think there's when I was watching it, just to watch it again and keep it fresh in mind for this conversation. The second Wallace strikes the English soldier, then he gets off his horse, or I think his horse is actually killed, and so he's dismounted, and then he pulls out a sharpened deer antler, which he uses to drive through another English soldier's skull. He's using whatever he can. He's using a club. He robs dead English soldiers' swords. So now he's got a weapon there, and he's just full of rage, and he's fighting the English soldiers. But it's still just him. But after he's taken out a few, all of a sudden the men of the village are inspired to fight with him. They see that, well, if he's doing it, so we can too. And they don't have weapons, they're just using farm tools or whatever they can. And I think this is something that, has always stuck with me. We've talked before, I've told you how I've got a pretty rebellious streak. And I wonder if some of it came from watching these movies as a young boy. It took an act of inspiration. It took someone crossing that line and showing the people that we can do this. It just takes that one momentous act that wakes people up, that shakes them out of their stupor or fear, like we saw in the wedding scene. That what can they do against these soldiers? Well, now here's someone he's just killed 3 of them with his bare hands, basically. Okay, let's help him. Let's do something. We can do this. And so the men of the village start fighting the English soldiers too. And once you kill a soldier, you can pick up his weapon, and now you have a decent weapon as well. And another thing that came to mind was just how much more difficult it is to do in the modern age, because the weapons are so unequal. So in a 13th century Scottish village, it's hand-to-hand combat. And the Scottish, even though they might not be armed, if they are strong enough and brave enough, they can still hold their own and even take out a few of these occupiers, and then pick up their weapons, put on their armor, and now things have been equalized. Now the English garrison and these Scottish villagers are on the same playing field, basically. They are equally armed. And it's just a question of who's brave enough, who is skilled enough, and who is strong enough to win. Whereas nowadays, and I think this is one of the reasons why, we're always asking, why hasn't there been any uprising after all of the insult and injury and oppression and tyranny, real tyranny, that Western governments are waging on their own people? Why hasn't there been any sort of uprising? Well, because nowadays, what can we do? I can be the strongest and most skilled fighter, hand-to-hand combat fighter, but what can I do against soldiers that have sniper rifles and tanks? Military. The militarized police can come in with tanks and RPGs and whatever. There's a security system in play. There's CCTV cameras everywhere watching my every move. Even this conversation could be monitored. So it's all very unequal, and it's very difficult to get your hands on the type of weaponry that would equalize the people against the regime. But in a medieval setting, it wasn't so difficult for that to happen. In fact, it happens in a matter of moments. The Scottish villagers fight back, and within a matter of moments, they are heavily armed. They are equalized. They are on equal terms, equal fighting terms with the garrison. And because they are motivated enough, because they are enraged, because they are oppressed, because they are getting off of their chest years of oppression, and because they are strong, stereotypically, strong, gigantic Scottish Highlanders against these little Englishmen, they can win, and they do. They defeat the garrison, they annihilate the garrison, and now it's like, well, now what do we do? Well, I guess we've just started a war, and this is where the film really kicks off.
I'll just say that you were mentioning tyranny. Another weapon that they have these days is they can advertise to you, the commoner, that you're not living in a tyranny, you're living in freedom. They can advertise that to you 24/7. So a lot of people aren't even aware that they're living in a tyranny. And they've become accepting of the idea of a lockdown, for example. They think that's perfectly normal now. Oh, they do it because they love us. They want to protect us, There was something else I wanted to say. Oh, yes. So you mentioned now all hell's going to break loose. And there is a speech Wallace gives because all the clansmen are coming down from the mountains and they tell him they're going to fight for him. And he more or less says, brothers, go home. Some of us are in this. And then they answer back and say, when the English garrison come through our villages, there'll be nothing left for us to defend. So they're more or less telling him, you fucked it up for everyone. You fucked it up for everyone. So now we have to join you to fight the English, So I thought that was really clever that they know right across Scotland, they know that it's now or never. Something unforeseen has occurred. It's changed the landscape. And now you have to very quickly get on the side of the people around you. And that's really it, because the English are just going to wreak revenge on everyone, more or less, on every single commoner.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very good. I'd like to get on to Robert the Bruce. Now, I'm just going to read a short excerpt here. And this is between him and his father, who is a leper. So this is when the rebellion has begun. And Robert the Bruce says, "Father, a rebellion has begun." The leper, "Under whom?" Robert, "A commoner named William Wallace." The leper, "A commoner? So no one leads Scotland." Now, I just say this could be from a previous draft, so it might not be exactly the same as the movie, but it's more or less the same. And then the leper says, I really like this. This is just a pragmatic political animal speaking here. "You will embrace this rebellion, support it from our lands in the north. I will gain English favour by condemning it and ordering it opposed from our lands in the south. Whichever way the tide runs, we will rise." And Robert, who's become enamored by the whole idea of rebellion and this commoner, Robert says, "This Wallace, he doesn't even have a knighthood, but he fights with passion and he's clever. He inspires men." And the leper, very wise, very sagacious, he says, "You admire him. Uncompromising men are easy to admire. He has courage. So does a dog. But you must understand this. Edward Longshanks is the most ruthless king ever to sit on the throne of England. And none of us, and nothing of Scotland will survive unless we are as ruthless, more ruthless than he."
Yeah. You wonder even if, is there a bit of you-know-who-ish ethnicity in the Bruce family there, playing both sides to come out on top no matter who wins. Very, very, very Rothschild. But yeah, this is another. So now we get into something. It's again, it's not exactly historically accurate. Robert the Bruce does get how would you say it? They really do an over on him, on poor Robert the Bruce. He's not depicted in the best way here. In fact, Robert the Bruce has a story more similar to this Hollywood version of William Wallace. His story is actually one about, and we know this is factual. It's not based on just some random accounts. We know that Robert the Bruce, they did murder his family members, his brothers. They did kidnap his wife and torture his wife, and they didn't kill her, but she was imprisoned. They did really make him suffer. Robert the Bruce really did suffer, and his family suffered because of his attempt to take the Scottish crown for himself and let Scotland be ruled by a Scottish king and get rid of English rule and occupation in Scotland. He did suffer. And there's a very good film, actually, a very good new film. It doesn't have much pause or diversity at all. It's called Outlaw King, and it was made by Netflix. So again, pretty surprising that Netflix actually didn't fuck this up. It's a very good film about the story of Robert the Bruce, and it's a bit more accurate because he is kind of depicted here as a bit of a playing both sides, and he's not very strong. He's easily manipulated, that sort of thing. But in the context of this Hollywood film, it just adds another dimension to it. So we have this contrast of Robert the Bruce, who's constrained by politics, and his father, who is, like you said, a political animal, in contrast with William Wallace and his sort of just pure, uncompromising devotion to a cause. And this is played out in real life many times. Just even think about the Irish and their revolutions against the English. If you think about Michael Collins and how he had a cause, but also he had to make concessions, and those concessions upset people who wanted more ideological purity and wanted to stay focused more on a goal, on a cause, and they didn't want to compromise, and this can cost you your life. And so you have to, again, like William's uncle and William's father told him, you have to use your wits. And so here we might see, as unpleasant as it is, the Bruces are using their wits, or at least Robert the Bruce's father is using his wits. But the heart wants that purity, that uncompromising devotion to a higher cause. So again, I think it does add a very good dimension to the film as a story.
The father does tell Robert the Bruce, he reminds him, you are the 17th Robert the Bruce. So he's more or less telling him, you got here because of not jumping in. You know, you got here by being smart, by boxing clever. So yeah, no, when I heard him saying about, support it in the north, but then we'll condemn it in the south, I was thinking of these corporations. So for example, a few years ago, Real Madrid, they made a decision to sell their jerseys in the Middle East without the crucifix on it. But at the same time, in Europe, for the European market, they'll sell it with the crucifix on it. So this type of thing,
or like when they during however many gay pride months there are now, it seems like there's more than one. They'll all put the rainbow flag on their social media profile pictures, except in traditional countries like Islamic countries where that's not on, and other not global homoized countries, they won't change their profile pictures with the rainbow flag, but they'll do it in the decadent West. They'll do it for us.
Exactly. We should discuss the son of Longshanks. Now, I think anyone with half a brain cell knows that he's most likely not of heterosexual persuasion. He has been given this beautiful French princess, and he can't even look at her. He hates being in the same room as her. He prefers to be with his best friend. And what's your impression of this? Because I think the relationship is the psychology here is interesting. For example, Longshanks knows that his son is going to be absolutely useless, and he starts paying more attention to the princess than his own son. And there is a very famous scene where he comes in. He's really angry because William Wallace has just sacked York, and a basket is delivered, and it's the King of York. His head is in the basket, and this startles Longshanks, and he says, "I better start making plans, or it'll be my head in a basket." And he realizes that his son hasn't really done anything while he's been away in France. So while he's been away trying to press their rights in France, his son has not really done anything to quell the rebellion in Scotland. So he's really angry. And the son tells Longshanks, but I can't remember the guy's name, but more or less his best friend.
Philip.
Yes, Philip.
Philip, his military advisor.
His military advisor.
Wink,
yes.
wink.
So he puts him. What is the word, to defenestrate or something like this? So you throw them out the window.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a really good scene. He realizes that this Philip guy is trouble, and this Philip guy is taking.
It's funny too, because when I was a kid, I didn't notice some of the power play. Why? Like, it's so shocking, right? So I'm sure anyone who's seen Braveheart knows that this is the scene where Edward II, future Edward II, tells his father that this is my military advisor, and then Edward I says to the military advisor, "Oh, really? Well, advise me. What would you do about the present situation?" And he just throws him out the window. But if you watch the scene and you pay attention to some of the small details, you understand it's not just that Edward I is enraged at his son's incompetence. This Philip guy interrupts the king. He talks when he's not asked to speak. He's very presumptuous. He says, "I'm an expert on military tactics." When Edward I asks his son a question, this Philip guy answers. So he's very disrespectful, and to show how ruthless Edward I can be, they use this as an example of, Edward I is not going to tolerate some upstart interrupting him or speaking when he's not been spoken to. So he just throws him out the window. So I think, when I saw this, as a child, it was kind of like, whoa, why did he do that? And of course, even as a young child, I'm sure I didn't even pick up on like the mamby-pamby bits, of this character. Only when I started watching it again, having a bit more life experience, can you pick up on these things. Talking about historical inaccuracies, this part is actually not the scene, but the portrayal of Edward II is accurate. He was a pufter, and he did have a relationship with his advisor. And he was such a bad king, and he was such a bad husband to the French queen, the French princess that he married, that in the end, his French wife got so fed up with him that she succored the French nobles back in her home country to rally around her and sort of like depose Edward II. And it got so bad that Edward II's own nobles turned against him because he was such a bad king. He was horrible. He was everything that Edward I accomplished, his son undid. And his own nobles turned against him. His own wife turned against him. When his wife turned against him, she got all of France to side with her. So like the French are basically chasing him now. His own nobles are chasing. He ended up being like chased throughout England. He was chased through the forest. I think so. His advisor / lover got captured and like torn to bits by hunting dogs, or hunting dogs captured him, and then he was imprisoned and then killed. And then, according to legend, Edward II got captured by the French, and because they knew of his sexual preferences, they killed him by shoving a hot iron through his anus. So that's how this character that we see in the film met his demise in real life. So yeah, this portrayal is not actually inaccurate. There's some other inaccurate portrayals, but this one was actually pretty spot on. So yeah, I think they got this one right, and it was it might be exaggerated here and there, like the whole throwing out the window scene and everything, but I think it works, and it's necessary to show also just how ruthless this villainous king is.
The Scottish nobles I found very problematic, and this is a situation where you have to work with them, but at the same time they're kind of bought and sold. And it would be kind of like taking on big pharma in your country, and your politicians, your media people all have lots and lots of shares in big pharma. So yeah, I found this quite upsetting, especially for Wallace, because Wallace he just wants the English out. He's not really, although he is educated, he can speak a number of languages, he doesn't really know much about politics. And he says to Robert the Bruce that the Bruce is the guy who can unite them. And we find out later that Robert the Bruce betrays Wallace. He betrays him and then saves his life at the same time. The Celts, this is something I noticed as well. The commoners, they bicker a lot with each other. They find it very difficult to reach a consensus. And I think this is one of the liabilities of the Celtic people in general. It's very hard at times to get them to all follow in the same direction. Self-interest can dictate things, and yeah, I don't know. What do you make of this? What do you make of this situation? The nobles, the commoners, the lack of cohesion.
Yeah, I can see why you would think it's a Celtic problem. Again, using Celtic sort of just to describe the peoples of Ireland and Scotland and Wales, because it is something that happened throughout the centuries. They just couldn't unite against the common enemy. Instead, they would bicker amongst themselves. Jonathan Bowden referred to this as tall poppy syndrome. And it's not necessarily a phenomenon of the Celtic peoples. This is pretty much found anywhere. You can see this in Southern European culture as well. You can see this in Germanic culture. That you can see this on the dissident right. That whenever someone rises up, I guess you could even call this, the crabs in the bucket syndrome. Whenever someone rises up, whenever a poppy gets too tall, or whenever a crab starts to climb up the bucket, that poppy gets cut down by the other poppies. That crab gets pulled back into the bucket by the other crabs. We have people on our own side who hold us back because they are petty, because they are jealous, because the person who's rising up doesn't conform 100% to their notions of the ideal leader or the perfect ideology or the correct goals in mind. So I think we've talked about this, the lack of leadership is a huge problem. But how can we have good leaders when we're all acting under this tall poppy syndrome? We're all acting under this crabs in the bucket syndrome mentality. Who would want to be a leader of a people like this? And yeah, this did happen. This is just tale as old as time. You can find this, in any situation. Look at the demise of Julius Caesar. There were many reasons why he was assassinated. Amongst them, the fear and envy of the ruling class, who were afraid of this guy rising too tall. And you can look at an event from such a long time ago and think, well, what does it matter now? But the reforms that Julius Caesar had in mind before they killed him would have been amazing. And in fact, there was many economic and financial reforms that he wanted to implement, and the banking class could not let that happen. So actually, that was another reason why he had to go. And that also is a tale as old as time. How many times someone has tried to reform banking and finance and they end up getting assassinated or their entire country plunged into war as punishment for even having those thoughts. And then, yeah, you mentioned just imagine nowadays trying to, take on big pharma. And so you go to your local politicians and they're all in the pocket of big pharma. So what can be done here? And this is the corruption of democracy, to be honest. This is what happens. This is the corruption of politics, power plays. This is why monarchy, whatever your opinions are of it in practice, I don't think it can be denied that in theory and in myth and legend, monarchy is sort of idealized. And even Tolkien talked about this in some of his letters to his son during the Second World War, when his son was off fighting and writing letters to his father. And even Tolkien said, he basically opined about the whole mess. This is the problem of nation states, of states, state governments, big government apparatuses, who we don't even know who are the responsible figures that are taking these decisions to, throw millions of lives into the rubbish bin, to just waste all these millions of lives in this war that is being determined by, shadowy figures behind the curtain. We don't even know who are the accountable leaders anymore, because we just have these big, increasingly bigger government states with all these different figures and all these different departments and administrations, and on it goes. Whereas if you have a monarchy, you know who's making the decisions, you know where the buck stops, as it were, you know who's responsible, and you know who to complain to. And in fact, we can actually see in many occasions throughout medieval history that the peasants, which basically just means, working class, rural working class of the medieval period, 14th century in England, or 11th century, whatever, that in some ways, in many ways even, they had more liberty than we do now. And there were occasions where if the peasants were unhappy, they could either, revolt, but not even going to that extreme. I can't remember exactly where. I think it was in England. And I think it was in either in England or France around the 14th century. There was this moment where some lord was mistreating the peasants, or he did something that really pissed off the peasants, the working class, the rural working class, his subjects. And so the peasants of this province went directly to the king, or the person above this lord in the feudal hierarchy, and they said, this guy, this lord, is doing things that we really don't agree with. We don't like this at all. You need to do something about him. And the king went down to this province, arrested the lord, figured out what was going on, figured out if he was guilty of the things that the peasants were accusing him of, determined that he was, had him executed, and the peasants were given basically all of the things that they were asking for, and their injustices were remedied. Imagine that happening now. It's just impossible that, hey, the federal government is oppressing us. So we go to our local township, we go to our local government. Can you guys do something about this? Or vice versa. The local township is doing something that we don't agree with. So we go to the higher up. I mean, you just imagine all of the red tape and paperwork and bureaucracy and false promises that would take place. And there's other things too, like, that can, we can talk about the differences between life now and life then. But yeah, just the corruption that you've touched on there, and the backbiting and the double crossing. It seems like it's just a curse of the human condition.
Yeah, it's quite sad because at one of the battle scenes, Wallace, it's like he's trying to herd cats, and you've got some of the rebels saying, we didn't come here to fight for them. So mm-hmm. It's just a pity. I maybe, as you say, it's not just a Celtic thing. It's the human condition. But yeah, it just seems that it's very difficult to get people to see the bigger picture and say, right. For example, in the case of this rebellion in Scotland, they could get everyone on board and say, right, first order of business is we get the English out of Scotland. After that, we can settle all scores. After that, it can be a free-for-all for all I care, but let's just get rid of the English first. And it's very hard to get everyone on the same hymn sheet. Mm-hmm. So
I don't know if you've been following lately. There's been a bit of a back and forth in the online right regarding negative vision versus positive vision, and which one is more practical and which one is more necessary, or is it a bit of both? I think a bit of both probably is realistically the correct option, the correct answer. But the negative vision would be like what you just said, like just clear them out, just get rid of the English, just get rid of, in our situation nowadays, just get rid of this ruling class of totally detached, let them eat cake sort of mentality elites, and just clear them out, replace them with ourselves, or better ruling class, better elites. And then when these people, when these globalists, when these transhumanists, when these degenerates are cleared out, then we can talk about, all right, well, now what do we do? I think that the negative vision, if you look at history, if you just have a negative vision, if you just have the idea of, well, just let's get rid of these guys, but you don't have a positive vision, you don't have an idea of what you want when you have power, you end up with like bloody reigns of terror. The revolution just sort of turns on itself. And because you don't have a positive vision, you only have a negative vision, you're just looking for anyone who fits the definition of the negative, anyone who could be described as the enemy. And that's why you have the revolution turns on itself and starts just killing everyone who's not, ideologically pure enough. Whereas if you have a positive vision, not just clearing them out, but also let's do something, let's build something, then you usually don't have such a bloody reign of terror, and you can actually you can establish something in place of the erstwhile regime. So that's interesting. And then also, like, when you talk about that battle, that was interesting too, because this is the first battle that the Scots win. It's a great moment. William Wallace, Mel Gibson gives the famous "What will you do without freedom?" speech. It's a great speech, but you're right. Until Wallace and these renegades arrive, this battle was going to be played out like every other battle. And this is actually pretty accurate. The costumes not so accurate, some of the characters not so accurate, but the battle depictions are pretty accurate. So you have the Scottish nobles on the battlefield, and across the field are the English. And before the battle, they're going to negotiate terms. They don't want to, have both sides massacring each other, or pretty much more likely the Scottish just ending up being massacred by the English cavalry. So they're going to negotiate terms. And even before they start negotiating, the Scottish soldiers, who aren't soldiers, these are farmers, these are blacksmiths, these are just average men who have mediocre weapons, mediocre armor, but they've been recruited into the armies of these Scottish nobles. And now they're taking on like a professional fighting force, knights on horseback with armor, and they can see that they don't stand a chance. So they start to walk off the battlefield. And the nobles, the Scottish nobles, say, "Wait, please do not flee. At least let us negotiate. Let's negotiate terms. Let's see if we can get something out of this." And the Scottish are just basically saying, "No, we're not coming here to just die for you." But then Wallace shows up and he says, "Sons of Scotland, where are you going?" And he gives this great speech where he appeals to nationalism. He appeals to ethno-nationalism. And he says, this is a chance for Scotsmen, sons of Scotland, to tell our enemies that you may take our lives, but you will never take our freedom. And this appeal to emotion, to brotherhood, to bonds of kinship, to bonds of ethnicity, of the clan, is what not only convinces, but then inspires these unprofessional amateurs, farmers and blacksmiths, to stay on the battlefield and fight back. And there's a good side to that, and there's a bad side to that, because this is how nation states, the modern nation state, which arose in the 1800s, 1900s, this is how they convinced millions of men to fight and die in 2 world wars and pretty much every war of the modern era. They whip up sentiment of nationalism. They get you to care about the flag and the anthem and this piece of land inside of arbitrarily drawn borders. And they appeal to your patriotism and all this stuff. And so now you've got to fight the Hun, even though he's very similar to you, and he hasn't done anything to you. He hasn't invaded your country or imposed unfair taxes on you or thrown you into a lockdown for 67 days. He hasn't done any of that. But through propaganda and through appealing to emotion and through appealing to our bonds of fellowship and ethnicity, which they will do when convenient, the ruling class will do when convenient. Now you've got all these Frenchmen, for example, or Englishmen chomping at the bit to go and fight the German, even though we're all basically cousins, if not even brothers. So there is a negative side to this, because this is how, and these wars were bankers' wars. These are ruling class using us as pawns on the chessboard. We're not fighting for the interests of the French nation or the English nation, if you take that word for what it really means, to be, a tribe of people united by blood. No, we're fighting for the interests of Rothschild bankers, Zionists, politicians looking to climb up the pyramid of power. We're fighting for the interests of an agenda, for example, that's well above and beyond what we can see playing out. But these are not things that inspire men to give up their lives, as we see in the film. The men aren't going to fight and die for the interests of these nobles who are going to negotiate, and okay, well, we'll walk off the battlefield and we'll stop this nonsense rebellion if you give us a bit more land, Mr. King of England. Well, the men don't want to fight for that cause. They don't care about these nobles getting some more land on their estates. But they do care about fighting for the Scottish people. And that's what William gives them. And in the film, he's not doing it to manipulate them and to make them all, die for his agenda. We see him as he's depicted as a genuine freedom fighter. So that's the positive side. But I think in real life, we see this play out in a much more cynical way.
Okay, getting back to your talk on positive vision and negative vision, I would say start off with the negative vision. Have the positive vision in mind, but don't disclose it, because if you do, you'll lose half of your followers. Start off with a negative vision, but yeah, have the positive one ready. So we move on to, I really like this part, and it's where the ordinary Scottish people are starting to speak about Wallace, and it's like Chinese whisper. And as his name goes from town to town, it takes on this mythical power. And they say like he killed 700 men in a day, or 7 feet tall. What is it? You'll probably remember it. He has bolts of lightning. What is it? Bolts of lightning from his eyes or from his ass.
Oh yeah, that's when he comes to the battlefield and he's telling the soldiers who are starting to get weak at the knees, and he says, "I'm William Wallace. Fight with me." And they said, "No, you're not William Wallace. Wallace is 7 feet tall." And William responds, "Yes, I've heard. And if he were here, he'd kill the English with bolts of lightning from his eyes and thunder from his arse."
That's it. And then there's a scene, actually, there's a villager. He says, "And William Wallace killed 50 men, 50 if it was one." And then you have a farmer saying 100 men.
And then there's the other one, the one that I really love is so it's like two men in a pub, basically a medieval tavern, and one of them is saying, "I heard Wallace cut through the English and he can't get the simile." So his friend finished it for him. "He cut through them like Moses through the Red Sea."
That's right. And he says, hacked off 200 heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that.
And that is basically true. That is, Wallace did become a legendary figure in his time, which is quite an accomplishment.
Yeah. It just shows you the power of word of mouth, that a human being can become a superhero in a relatively short space of time. So, right, we're coming towards the end. Is there anything else you would like to add? I know we could talk about when they finally capture him and all that. If you want to talk about anything in relation to the rest of the movie, fire ahead.
Well, again, so separating the film from fact, I do think it is a very moving scene. There's lots of pathos in the scene where it's the battle that William loses, both historically and in the film, the Battle of Falkirk. And this is the battle where, in the film, Robert the Bruce betrays Robert the Bruce and some of the other more important nobles betray Wallace. Two of the nobles don't join the battle with their cavalry; they just ride off. William was expecting their support, and they just ride off into the distance because the King of England granted them some more lands in exchange for them breaking off their support for William Wallace. And then Bruce is there, actually in English armor, fighting with the English. And there's a moment where Wallace, enraged, gets on his horse and tries to take down the king, and Robert the Bruce is ordered to defend the king, and so he sort of jousts William Wallace and takes him down with his lance. And then we see William get up and surprise Robert the Bruce, who we don't know it's him. He tackles him and takes off his helmet, and then we see that it's Robert the Bruce. And there's this great scene where you can see there's no words, and Mel Gibson does a very good job, actually, I think, as an actor in this scene. You can just see in his eyes the pain of this betrayal, because we saw in previous scenes that the Bruce was Wallace's favorite noble. William sees honor and potential in Robert the Bruce. He even tells him, if you would unite us, we would follow you. So would I. And so then to see that he's been betrayed by this man is just so painful for him. And, you know, he's covered in blood. He's exhausted. He's been fighting. He's lost this battle. And now on top of it, he's been betrayed by what he thought was Scotland's best noble. And you see it in his eyes. And even later, the Bruce says to his own father, like, I can't do this anymore. I can't betray him anymore. I saw it in his eyes. I can't betray this man anymore. I'm not going to be on the wrong side. Now, historically, it's a bit unfair on Robert the Bruce, because historically, Robert the Bruce actually betrayed the English in order to join Wallace. So it's the other way around. But in this film, obviously, it wouldn't work to show it that way. You know, you wanted, obviously, the screenwriter and Mel Gibson wanted to have this scene of pathos. They really tried to humanize Wallace as much as possible, because they believed that if they didn't have these moments of pathos, you know, they kill his wife, he's betrayed by Robert the Bruce, all it would be then would just be a film which I guess probably would be popular nowadays, the way audiences have changed, or the way the film industry has changed audiences. I guess a film like that could work today, where it's just a guy on a revenge mission. You know, you think like John Wick, I guess. But in 1995, they tried to make it a bit, you know, like high art. This film won 5 Oscars, you know, so they're trying to make it a bit more like high art. And so they want to give it more pathos. So, you know, we can see this also in other parts of the film, like when he goes to speak with the Queen of France, and they are speaking in Latin, the Queen and her advisor, and her advisor says, you know, don't trust a word. He's a liar and a savage. And William responds in Latin, I never lie, but I am a savage. So they did want to show that William is, I think they were also playing a bit on the stereotypes, like, you know, the savage Scottish stereotype, the savage Celtic peoples in comparison to the cosmopolitan English. You can see it in the costume. Their hair is always dirty and crazy. And, you know, like I mentioned the costumes, they're wearing kilts, which they weren't wearing at that time, but they never wear any armor, which is just ridiculous. They would have had, especially, you know, important people like Wallace and his knights, they would have had good armor, good weapons, good horses. But in the film, they're portrayed as just always wearing like leather and, you know, basically like potato sacks as clothes, and they're always dirty. So they were trying to show him as a bit of a savage, but they also wanted to give him this nobility and this pathos. So I understand why they made those choices, but yeah, a historical purist would object, I suppose.
Can I ask you a question? When you had your 2 VHS tapes, and a few minutes into the film, when you saw that they were wearing kilts and, you know, kilts hadn't come about at that stage, did you throw the VHS tapes out the window?
To be honest, I didn't know about this. So, like, when I first saw Braveheart, I think it was on television, and I really liked it. And my parents, who were actually quite strict as parents, they wouldn't let me watch a lot of things, but they let me watch anything that had to do with history, because I guess they saw it as educational. So even though if there was like a huge amount of blood and gore and beheadings and stuff, that was okay, because hey, it's history. So they really liked it, and then they bought me the VHS tapes. But I was a kid. I had no idea that these costumes were anachronistic or whatever. You know, another thing too, like very famous, is when they go to battle. Only Wallace and his men do this. So we know that, like, the film gets criticized for this because it's like another historical inaccuracy. So Wallace and his men always show up to battle painted in blue, in woad, right? And that's very famous. It's very iconic. But of course, the historians object, and it's, by this point in history, the 13th century, Scottish warriors were no longer painting themselves in woad. And that's true. And the film doesn't make any claim that the Scottish were doing this, because all the other Scottish warriors aren't painted, only Wallace and his men. And I wish, and maybe there's like, maybe there's footage that was never put in the final cut, but I wish that there would have been just a moment, a little bit of exposition where they explain in maybe a conversation or something, or they show Wallace and his men painting themselves, and they explain, we're doing this to give homage to our pagan ancestors, our savage, quote unquote, pagan ancestors who would paint themselves blue in these different symbols to protect them, give them power, or just express their culture. And so I thought that would have been a nice touch if they would have explained that. But when I was a kid, I just saw Scots in kilts and painted blue, and I thought that that's just what they did. It was only until much later that I learned that these things were not exactly historically accurate. But for me personally, I don't care. Like I am capable of separating whether it's a book adaptation or adapting historical events. You just have to make certain sacrifices, and also you have to make certain embellishments depending on the medium you're using, film in this case, depending on the audience, depending on what you want to portray, what you want to use the story as an engine to portray something. Like we mentioned earlier, the great speech he gives, he's clearly depicted as a freedom fighter. Later, you mentioned the film The Patriot, very similar. We see a film that takes some liberties with history, but it's in order to show this story of how you have to fight for your freedom, you have to take on tyranny, which is one of the reasons. And I watched these films all throughout my childhood. I've loved these films. I love films about this theme of fighting back against the oppressor, which is why it was so frustrating for me during the past 2 years to see that despite all of the films we've seen about the righteous rebel, despite all of the films we've seen about the heroes, the Marvel heroes who fight for the heroic cause, and they never compromise on their cause for justice and protecting humanity, in spite of having seen all these films, it seems like no one internalized them, no one was inspired by them to live them out, which is like it's just very modern, because for ancient peoples, the whole point of especially orally, recounting generation after generation, these oral traditions, like the Iliad, for example, the whole point of that was to instill values in your tribe and to live up to those values, especially when it mattered most, like going to war. The story of Hector and Achilles and all that was used to inspire bravery in Greek soldiers and give them an example to live up to. Whereas nowadays, it's like we see all these films, we see all these stories, but we just are entertained by them, but we don't internalize the values or try to live up to them in any way. So that was just another thing that always stood out to me, more than the costumes or anything like that.
I was just thinking there, about suspending your belief as you watch a movie. It wouldn't have been good if Mel Gibson had rocked up in his Scottish village and said, "Good day, put another shrimp on the barbie." Would have kind of destroyed the feeling of the film. I was going to say
that many people actually thought he was Scottish. A lot of people outside of outside of the know, outside of Scotland, for example, or a lot of Americans, I suppose, of course, actually thought Mel Gibson was Scottish.
Tom Cruise, I think, played an Irish character in a film, and his accent was just terrible. But Americans would probably think, "Wow, he did a bang-up job."
Like Mel Gibson's Scottish accent isn't that good in this film, actually, but Americans don't know any better. And he did become like this. This is his most iconic role, I would say. And like American audiences thought that, oh yeah, Mel Gibson, he's Scottish. They didn't remember, no way, actually, no, where is he from, actually? Oh, he's Australian, whatever, Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't like, obviously I'm not Scottish, but I've spoken to a lot of Scottish people, and I have to say his accent wasn't dreadful. Like it wasn't brutal or anything like that. It was decent enough. But obviously for Scots, if he walked into a bar and spoke in that accent, they would very quickly know he's not from around. He's not from around those parts. I was going to say, you mentioned the language thing as well, the kind of language barrier, and where the princess is talking with some advisor, they're talking in front of him in Latin and then maybe in French, and he starts speaking those languages. And I've often wondered about this, because if you read classical Russian novels, generally the serfs, they don't speak French, and the aristocracy spoke French. So when you have scenes where the aristocrats want to speak in front of the serfs, they'll change to French. And I often wonder, with this kind of longing for a return to the traditional Catholic Mass, and that would be in Latin. I hear a lot of people saying they would like this. A lot of Catholics saying they would like to return to the traditional Mass, and it sounds much nicer than the modern Mass, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't heard any of them saying they'd like to learn Latin. So it's almost as if they would like not to know what's being said. It's almost as if ignorance is bliss in a way. And I just wonder about this. Is it kind of in a lot of our genes that we would prefer to just bow down to people who know more than we do? And like during this scamdemic, even a lot of ordinary people would say, "Oh, you're not an expert. What do you know?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost as if, who do you think you are, having an opinion? You're not supposed to have an opinion. Dr. Fauci, he knows what he's talking about. I saw him on the telly last night. I just wonder, is there this kind of longing for feudalism by the commoners in this day and age?
I think there's three things I would say. I think one, yes, in general, what you said there. I think the appeal to authority, which is actually a logical fallacy, if you take like any sort of courses in debate or anything like that, the appeal to authority has become really ingrained in modern society, particularly because I think so many of us are going to university now, and we have such a dependency on your credentials. Credentialism is so important now. So you can't have an opinion unless you have credentials. Everyone wants to know your credentials. You have to put your credentials on your CV. You can't even get a job in a fast food restaurant without having credentials on your CV. So this appeal to authority has become a feature now of our society. It's not a bug. It's become a feature. And I really oppose this. I really object to it. I find it very disagreeable. Because a lot of people, you can put as many initials next to their name, and you can put as many credentials as you want next to their name, but they're not really thinkers. They're not really that clever. I think Tesla had a quote where he said, anyone can think deeply about something, but it takes a true philosopher, it takes a true intellect to think like thoroughly about something or wisely about something. Something like that. I'll have to pull that quote up later. So yeah, I think that could be one reason. Then, like I said earlier about the idealization of monarchy, and how, at least even practically, with a monarchy or a dictatorship or anything like that, at least you know who has authority and who's responsible for bad times and who is to praise for good times. And so I think that sort of thing just simplifies everything. And so people are like the simplicity of that. And also, I just think that was the form of organizing society for such a long time that perhaps it is now, even you could say, a part of our DNA. It's certainly part of our genetic memory that we for such a long time, European society, at least European tribes, were organized in a hierarchical manner with chieftains or kings, and so we do respond to that in a positive way. I think that will just also be a part of us. So I can see that as well. Regarding the people who would like to see a return to Latin Mass, it could be something to do with that as well. In this case, having going back to having Mass in Latin, I don't know if it's so much because they just want to submit and just let the experts carry on with it. In this case, I think it's because whether people realize it or not, and even the most smug cosmopolitan people who think that we are living in the most enlightened times, I think even they know somewhere in the unquiet parts of their minds late at night that no, we're not. We are not living in the most enlightened times, and we have not progressed. And actually, the idea of constant progress and that history is a direct line from, savagery and benighted society to progress, always progressing. They know that that's bunk, that that's nonsense, but they don't want to admit it. And so, and then most people who aren't, that's, other people who aren't that smug sort of cosmopolitan mindset also feel that the era we're living in now is shallow and superficial, and it doesn't satisfy so many of our instinctual human needs. We don't have much contact with nature. We're in the rat race constantly. And for all the talk of diversity nowadays, the world has never been less diverse. And we've lost so much. Whether you want to talk about animal species, I think it's 90% of all animals have actually gone extinct. Most of them since the Industrial Revolution. We've also lost lots of culture, languages. We talked earlier about how the English outlawed Welsh, Gaelic, Scotch, all of those languages were illegal. And they basically went to the point of extinction because of that. Going back to nation states, the idea of these united nations, like a united Italy, a united Spain, that has also resulted in the death or near death of lots of older Spanish quote unquote nations, like small n nations, the Galicians, the Catalans, or in the case of Italy, all of the different regions that comprise, nowadays we call it Italy, but in the past, up until the 1860s, those were, people who saw themselves as distinct, and they had, in many cases, their own language and their own customs, similar languages, similar customs, but they were, in a sort of way, they were unique to them. And so it's all become very homogenized. And so I think people are having a sense of wanting a return to things like Latin Mass because they want some tradition back in their lives. They want some authenticity back in their lives. They're a bit unsatisfied with culture being nothing more than, McDonald's, La Liga football, or Premier League, football. What does it mean to be Irish? Oh, drinking Guinness and eating Tato, right? I've seen on Twitter, Nigerians, black as night Nigerians, saying that they're just as Irish as anyone else because look at the Tato I'm eating and the pint of Guinness I'm drinking. That is not what it means to be Irish. There is something deeper. And so you even see this, not just with Latin Mass, but people are actually starting to get really interested in learning old languages and near dead, if not dead languages. So there is, and actually in a weird way, in a ironic way, modern technology is helping this. So some of the most popular languages on Duolingo, for example, are Latin and Gaelic. And I've actually I studied Latin as a child, not profoundly, but I learned a bit of Latin, and it actually helped me learn modern languages because you can see the Latin roots in them. But I've actually started to use some modern technology to learn some more Latin as not just as a linguistic tool, but also just to maybe even have a conversation in Latin, maybe even say some phrases in Latin and understand spoken Latin. And I've also done so with the Welsh language and Gaelic, and you can find resources to help you with that. And I think it's actually getting more and more popular, even amongst, what you might call normies. And I would recommend it for anyone to do this, especially people who identify themselves as traditionalists or, people who might be in the dissident right, whatever that means nowadays. I would recommend doing this as well because, these are the roots of our people, our old languages and our old customs. And also, it'll broaden your horizons so much and open the doors to so many things. And it also gives you an advantage because there's a lot of old texts that if you don't speak the old languages, you can't read them firsthand for yourselves. You have to depend on, again, that appeal to authority. You have to depend on the experts to translate them for you. But if you know the language in which these old original documents were written, then you can read them for yourselves and make your own conclusions. So it gives you an advantage.
Yeah, it also gives you a different perception of existence. In Irish, if you want to say I'm hungry, you say "Tá ocrasorum," which more or less means the hunger is on me, and the idea is that it's pressing down on you. And yeah, it's amazing actually how the Welsh maintained their language, because in the case of Ireland, yeah, we had the sea separating us for a long time. It was a bulwark against the English. The Welsh didn't have that advantage, and yet. If you look at Wales, Scotland and Ireland, the Welsh have really been the ones who have maintained their language. And I think I saw a documentary years ago. There were even towns in Patagonia in Argentina.
Yes.
Where they spoke Welsh.
There's a part of Argentina which it has the flag has the red dragon of Wales on it. That region's flag it's a blue. It's like the flag of Argentina, a blue stripe, a white stripe, another blue stripe. And that center white stripe is the red dragon of Wales. Yeah,
it's really funny. It's just in the middle of nowhere you have these. I don't know. Is that still the case? Because this documentary was from 20 years ago. So I don't know. Are they still speaking Welsh in those?
I think so. I think it's in the same way that Wales is utilized today. Like it's on road signs. It's the name of certain shops and pubs are all in Welsh, and I think it is spoken amongst a significant part of the population.
A few years ago, I had an Argentinian girlfriend, and she wanted to know if I spoke Gaelic, and I said, "Oh, I only know a little bit." I said, even though we went through many years of it in school, nobody really speaks it. We never speak it. And then she said, "I wish you could speak Welsh." And I said, "Why?" And she said, because I think she said it was similar to the Elvish language in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. I mean,
is that true?
I wouldn't be surprised, the way that Tolkien was such a great linguist and how he took inspiration from old European religions, myths, and languages. I couldn't tell you what Welsh or what Elfish sounds like. I mean, I love The Lord of the Rings. I watch it frequently and I read the books as well. And Elfish is spoken in the films, but I guess like if I were to listen to a scene where there's some Elfish spoken and then listen to a recording of someone speaking Welsh, I might be able to see some similarities or hear some similarities. But without that knowledge, I would just say I suspect that it's true.
Okay, so yeah, in regard to an empire, they really have to try and snuff out the languages very quickly. And even Franco in Spain, he made it, was it illegal to teach Catalan in schools? And if you want to unify the nation, I actually remember years ago, I worked with two Italian guys. One was from Milan and the other guy lived near Napoli.
And, oh, wow.
Yeah, I remember the
huge difference.
Yeah, the Napoli guy said to me, he said, I could speak a sort of Italian to the guy from Milan and he wouldn't understand anything I'm saying. And I couldn't believe this, because I was thinking, right, in Ireland, okay, we speak in English. And I was thinking maybe in some parts of Ireland, they use a few different words. Maybe for example, in County Kerry, in rural County Kerry, it's a very strong accent. It might be sometimes difficult to understand what they're saying for me, for example. But I was thinking it's impossible that you wouldn't be able to understand everything they say. It's impossible. But yet, this is what he was telling me, that
he's not only so someone from Milan and someone from Napoli, they probably don't even consider themselves of the same Italian nation. Like they are, obviously. But again, like I said, before Italy was united, it was the indigenous people, the Italic people living on that peninsula, they were disparate, and they were ruled either by the French or the Austrians or the Spanish. So they actually for many years didn't even have autonomy of their own country, and they certainly didn't see themselves as a united nation. They had to go through that unification process. But there is such a difference between, think of it as a difference between, a Scottish Highlander and an English Londoner. Like, yes, you're ethnically very similar and related, but you're also very different. So that's sort of like I would say the difference between someone from Milan and someone from Napoli, just as sort of like how they identify as a person. And then when you add in the language difference, so you're right, in Italy, it's not just a question of different accents, which are hard to understand depending on where you're from. And it's not even a question of different dialects. There are certain dialects. There are tons of dialects in Italy, just loads. And some of them are very, very different. But you can still sort of tell that they are speaking a form of Italian. But it's just a very different dialect. But then you do have, even on top of that, dialects which are so different that it can be debated whether or not they're actually completely distinct languages. And some linguists do consider them distinct languages. So there are some who do consider what is spoken in Naples, Napolitano, right, to be a distinct language from Italian. And then certainly, like the indigenous language of Sardinia, Sardo, I think it would be called, that is also very distinct. It's not Italian. It's not a dialect of Italian. It is something totally distinct from Italian. It's related, but it's distinct.
It's similar to Catalan, isn't it? The Sardinian local language.
Is it? I think. I mean, I think it is.
I heard something about that. Yeah, that it has some
I think
connection,
it might be.
Catalonia was Catalonia was actually, it wasn't a very big empire, but it was an empire at one stage, and I think they conquered Sardinia and some of the islands there. So. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say actually, just to get back, we've got off track, but I think it's fine. It's fine. This is the nice thing. You can discuss something and then it leads on to other things. I was going to say, when you spoke about credentials and how a lot of people these days, they worship those credentials, I was thinking that it's not so long ago, like maybe let's say 120 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, that in Europe, in various countries, if you were a commoner and you went into, a lord's land and you hunted a rabbit and you were caught walking down the road with the rabbit in a sack, you'd be hanged the next day, and people would probably, like, I can imagine the common people, like, they wouldn't rebel. They would say, this is the way things are. Michael was crazy for going in there and doing that. He should have known. He should have known that, you don't trespass on the Lord's land and you don't steal his wild rabbits. So you would see that. You can often read these articles and it would list the name of a man and he was hanged for a rabbit, trying to feed his family, with a rabbit. So
the famous cases of the king's deer, right? Hunting the king's deer. Yeah,
that's right.
That's going back farther in history, the legends of Robin Hood and stuff. Many cases in the stories of Robin Hood, many of the injustices, many of the cruelties are because of someone going into Sherwood Forest and hunting the king's deer. And interesting also ties into what's going on now with the Great Reset and Reset the Table agenda and how they want to restrict our access to animal proteins. This is not new. Not every ruler in medieval history did this. Not every peasant lived under these conditions, but at various times in history, the ruling class, those higher up on the feudal pyramid, did keep the animal proteins for themselves, and the lower classes were resigned to eating veg and grains, and if they did get any protein, it would come maybe from eggs and pigs, and maybe whatever they could hunt, small things that don't have much meat on them anyway, like a rabbit, for example. But the greater part of animal proteins was reserved for the upper classes. And, nothing is ever new under the sun. And I see a lot of similarity in that with what's going on now, that they're trying to price the the unwashed masses out of certainly getting access to red meat, which is, in my opinion, the healthiest kind. If you eat it correctly, if you know what you're doing, it is a very healthy thing to eat. And we need protein. The human body needs protein, and animal proteins are absorbed in a way that is much better for us than getting protein from plant sources, and certainly getting protein from these synthetic lab-grown 3D printer meats that they're trying to, condition us into welcoming with open arms and whetted appetites. So yeah, I think there's definitely some eerie similarities there.
You see it actually in supermarkets, and I remember going to the company Telepizza.
Mm.
And all of the advertisements on the window were for veggie pizzas. It's like, and these are not popular.
They're pushing
these
it
are
so
not popular.
hard. No, no one buys
popular,
this.
but they're really trying to ram it down people's throats.
Oh yeah, like the KFC has got now, like it's totally plant-based fake meat chicken nuggets, but they look like they look like chalk. They look like rubbers. It's just horrible. No one's buying it, but the advertisements for it are everywhere. It's just everywhere. It's the same with Burger King or McDonald's. They're pushing these veggie burgers, plant-based burgers, and it's not exactly anything like the new wave of propaganda and advertising for it is a bit new. But I remember when like tofu and portobello mushroom burgers were a big thing, like a few years ago, maybe like almost like 10 years ago. I worked about 10 years ago in a vegan pub where all the food on the menu was vegan. So these things have been there's been a niche for them for some time, but lately there's been this just huge push to normalize it and popularize it in a way that wasn't so a few years ago.
Yeah. Getting back to that, Telepizza window, like they had 3 pizzas and all of them were like vegetarian. And I went in and I said, "Can I have a ham pizza, please?"
Can I just get a normal?
Yeah. Can I actually get a pizza?
With like real cheese, not like vegan fake cheese.
Yeah, you were saying as well, how we, we're in a very strange situation now, and I would say, like, in terms of the intellectual debates that go on, like at this moment in time, people can't even define what a woman is.
Yeah,
and that's a very worrying trend. Obviously, I know that you can't go on forever in this vein. Things have to change, but it's quite ridiculous that this is where we are now, where you have political people flummoxed over how to define a woman.
Yeah, because
to define a woman would be offensive, and therefore
going back to credentialism, there was that thing I saw coming out of the United States. Apparently, there's this black woman has been nominated as a judge to the Supreme Court, and she was asked, "Can you tell us what your views on this thing is? This transgender nonsense and stuff. Transsexual, actually, we should be called. And, can you define a woman?" They asked her. And she's responded, "No, I can't, because I'm not an expert." So it's, again, that appeal to authority that now we have to ask the feminists who majored in gender studies with, blue armpit hair. We have to appeal to them and ask them, "Experts, can you tell us what is a woman?" It's just another symptom of the modern era and its obsession with appeals to authority and also just its delusions.
There's something I noticed. I noticed it a few years ago. I found it disturbing, and now it seems more prevalent. And most of the people that you would consider to be in dissident circles, they follow the party line here, and that is when they're discussing, for example, the case of this swimmer, this man, who won the race. They will actually use the pronoun she when talking about, because they're afraid that they'll be put in prison, and obviously that could happen. That could happen now, but I just wouldn't care. I think once you start using their pronouns, You know, you've more or less given up your right to point out reality. You know, and that's a very dangerous place to be, where you can no longer actually say the sky is blue.
Well, it's something that Orwell wrote about in 1984, about how, you know, language was used to control the people, and language is used to, in some cases, literally, like, you know, wash their brains, erase facts, erase reality from their brains, their minds. And also we know that certainly the Soviet Union did this with their propaganda. I think it was is it Dalrymple, or I can't remember who it is, but he wrote about how Soviet propaganda was designed to break you down and make you accept things that you knew were lies to be true. That was the whole point of it. So yeah, I see that the West is evil. The ruling classes of the West, the culture of the West, has turned very evil, and they're doing basically the same thing. And they are expecting us to accept that something we know is a lie, that a human being with who is a male, who has male genitalia, male chromosomes, male DNA, who, when he is dead and archaeologists dig up his bones, they will be able to identify him as a man. We're now expected to say that this person is a female swimmer, and the best one there is, the champion, female of the year.
I heard two guys speaking recently about this swimmer, and they were saying, you know, how did we get here? This is just unbelievable. How did we get here? And it's not fair on biological women, that a trans woman. So the fact that they were saying a trans woman made me think, you know, yeah, this is how we got here. People like you know. And then they start saying she as well. So I thought, yeah, you absolute idiots. You know, you're fish in water. You don't realize you're in water. It's just unbelievable. Very strange times. But as I say, I think I'm not going to say 2 + 2 is 5. I'm not going to say it. And they can put whatever pressure they want, but I'm not going to deny reality. And that's just it.
Well, that's because I think you and I, we have, like I was saying earlier, we've internalized, you know, going back to the film that we've been discussing, we've internalized some of this, or maybe it's just it's a part of our innate nature. And, you know, okay, it's easy to say, it's easy to talk, but I think that you and I know in my case that I have, over the past 2 years especially, been very uncompromising in living according to my values. And just as William Wallace is as depicted in Braveheart, he refuses to pledge fealty to the King of England and confess the sin of treason. It won't save his life, but it will give him a quick death, a painless death. But even that isn't temptation enough. Even just saying, look, you're going to die, so just confess. Just confess that you committed treason. Just pledge fealty to the king, kiss the royal emblem, and we'll cut off your head and it'll be over. But he refuses to compromise. And he says, no, I won't even do that. I don't care if you're going to torture me. I'm not going. How can I commit treason to a king I never pledged allegiance to? I never swore fealty to the King of England. I don't want his mercy. And they really fuck him up. They what William Wallace went through. The film doesn't even go into it at all. Like, it kind of shows a little bit, but it was horrible what they did to him. And in the film, he has this very embellished, very artistic license being taken romance with the French princess. Obviously, that never happened. But she comes to visit him in prison, and she begs him to take this potion which will numb the pain. But William Wallace says, I can't take it because it will also numb my wits, and it might make me, do something that I wouldn't do in normal, in normal conditions, in conditions where I have total possession of my wits. Like, for example, it might make me weaker to the temptation begging for mercy and just getting a quick death. It might make me cry out in pain and make me an embarrassment, and I
kind
do that.
Kind of like a truth serum in a way.
Yeah, and so again, like we need more of these films, I guess, or we need to put these films back. It's just, of course, that's the reason why nowadays culture is just full of shows and series and films about sexually deviant children, like any fucking thing you can find on Netflix nowadays. Everything is just all about the banal of the modern era, our relationships, our sexual hang-ups, and blah blah blah. And films for children nowadays are just wild splashes of color and explosions of noise to keep the children entertained, but there's no deeper meaning. And if there is a deeper meaning, it's usually a corrupting one, a degenerating one. But tales of honor and devotion and being uncompromising in the face of adversity, it's almost like they're seen as cringe now. I guarantee that many Zoomers would cringe at William Wallace's speech to those soldiers, or they would cringe at his resoluteness under torture. And as we all know, what is the last word he cries out? They tell him, the executioner tells him that it can all be over. Just cry out for the king's mercy. Just cry out mercy. Just confess. And then William opens his mouth, and the executioner says to the crowd, the prisoner would like to say a word. But the word that William shouts with his last dying bits of strength isn't mercy, isn't I confess. He shouts out freedom, which in the Hollywood story, we are to believe that was his driving motivation, that and the memory of his wife. And it's just so clear that even in the Marvel Hollywood, films, the superhero films, even our superhero films, even our superheroes don't transmit these values anymore. Like, I haven't seen much of the Avenger films. I think I saw some of the Thor films, and they made a mockery of Thor. They turned him into this sort of arrogant prick. And it's like, this is a Norse god. This is the protector of mankind. This is the man who almost lifted the world serpent with his bare hands. This is the man who takes out, the beasts of Ragnarok and sacrifices himself. He knows he's going to his death, but he goes out and he fights the great snake, whose name I won't try to pronounce. And he knows that snake is going to kill him, but he goes out to fight it anyway to protect the world. Like, that's Thor. But this Hollywood Marvel version of him, he's an idiot. He's upstaged by the female characters. He's petulant. He's selfish. And of course, then he has a redemption arc where he becomes less of those things, but they make a mockery of him. So we can see that the modern era, post, I would suppose, 2000, although the rot goes like back centuries, but certainly post 2000, all of the pop culture, all the films have been completely subverted and inverted, where what was once good is now cringe. Sincerity has been replaced by irony, and honor has now been replaced by, like I said, these epic stories have been replaced by stories about just the banality of modern life, which is why it was, again, like really refreshing to see that Netflix made a film. It didn't get any attention, obviously. It didn't win any prizes. It didn't, it wasn't popular, but Netflix actually did make a decent film about Robert the Bruce, and in which some of these values are portrayed, are transmitted to the audience, values of struggling on through adversity, fighting for a cause, loving your family, etc.
Yeah, in the eyes of your typical Zoomer today, you were saying that they would sense that various aspects of the film Braveheart were cringe, or are cringe today. Even the idea of freedom would be cringe.
Oh yeah, good point. Exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah.
In 1995,
there's certain people on the so-called dissident right that would cringe at the idea of freedom. In
1995, that was the general consensus, that freedom meant something. It meant something. Now it's just it's a waste of time to even consider it, because that involves thinking, and who wants to think in 2022?
No, it's just freedom. Freedom is for boomers. Freedom is for boomers. Don't you know, my friend? Freedom is for boomers. We're not boomers. We don't want my freedom.
Yeah, freedom is for boomers, so they can go off in their RVs, and spend their children's inheritance.
Which I understand that criticism. I understand that, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because the boomers are selfish and didn't live up to the promise of freedom, didn't live up to the privilege of freedom, doesn't mean you throw it away for your own self.
It doesn't get you anywhere just condemning the boomers 24/7. It doesn't get you anywhere, They're on the way out. So yeah, I was going to say, there are a few things just to wrap up for the film. The scene where the Irish arrive. Now we didn't mention. I think his name is Brendan, and he's kind of the comic relief.
Stephen,
very good.
Yeah.
Thanks for correcting me. He's
Stephen is my name.
This, I thought it was a bit stage Irish when I watched it as a teenager, but my older self watching it, I can kind of say, it's fine. It's fine. You need that comic relief. I love the part where he says he's the most wanted man on his island, but he's not on his island. It's like saying, the killer hornets are out to get me, but I'm not in my home. I'm actually in the nest here amongst them.
It's another reference to blood and soil as well. My island. It's my island. I'm Irish. This is my island. I'm not on my island. I'm on your island. So it's again yes, these people are very genetically, ethnically similar, but an Irishman knows when he's not in Ireland and he's on the other island. There's another thing too about so Stephen joins them, and then as they approach the Battle of Falkirk, they find out that the English army has been reinforced by all these Irish soldiers. And they're all like, what? And Stephen, he comes back breathlessly after having done some scouting. He's like, it's true. I had to see it with my own eyes. The Irish are fighting with the English. And everyone's like, what the hell are they doing? Which is, again, it's good for the narrative, because later we see, as these two forces are about to clash in battle, the English king, who doesn't care at all about the Irish people, sort of sends them in first to, die first, basically. And as they're about to clash, they stop and they just start shaking hands. Hey, how you doing this morning? And everyone's embracing, which I think is a nice for the narrative, because it also shows something that is true, that the Anglo-Saxon and that certainly the Norman kings, which would be the ruling class, did not see themselves as part of the indigenous peoples of the British Isles, quote unquote, the British Isles, and Ireland, separate of that. But the people of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland were, the quote unquote Celtic peoples. And, if you look in Arthurian legend as well, they are fighting for survival and freedom against the Anglo-Saxons, or later in history, the Norman kings. So it was a nice touch to show the Irish and Scottish embracing and not fighting against each other. But historically, they wouldn't have been surprised at all if Irish soldiers made up the ranks of the English army, because the Irish wouldn't have had a choice, just as they didn't have a choice in real life throughout many of the wars of the British Empire. The Irish were recruited to go and fight for the Union Jack. So
I think I think in Braveheart they are actually conscripts, because they say conscripts from Ireland.
Yeah.
So they were brought over against their will, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And it should be mentioned as well, they're not very well armed. They have just spears. Or something. Like the Scots have swords and battle axes and all the rest. And the Irish have been just sent off to fight them with spears. So as you say, I think Longshanks says, use up the Irish, the dead cost nothing.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a scene where Seamus says, what the hell are the Irish doing fighting with the English? Like, he wouldn't have said that. He would have known they have no choice. Like, these are conscripts.
Yeah, and obviously the Irish know that they're being used. So,
and it's a funny thing too, that another thing about when the Irish are about to clash with the Scottish and they stop. It's very dramatic. The music is so tense, and then they stop and they just start shaking hands and embracing. It reminded me of something that I didn't know as a child when I was watching this movie for the first time. I understood, because my mom's side is Irish. I understood, and she even explained to me why are they shaking hands? Why are they fighting? It's because they're both basically the same people. They're not English. But later on, I learned that if you look at ancient Greek history, this happened as well. So like during the Persian Wars, there would be Greek tribes, Greek city-states that took the side of the Persians, but to the annoyance of Xerxes and Persian commanders, on many occasions, maybe not most, but on some occasions, the Greek soldiers who had, their ruling class had sided with the Persians, so now these Greeks have to go fight alongside the Persians. But on some occasions, when it came time to fight against their fellow Greeks, they would either not fight, or they would fight at a very low level of quality. They basically lose on purpose, to the annoyance of Xerxes and the Persian commanders, because these Greeks didn't want to fight their own kin. So we know from history, even ancient history, that bonds of kinship, blood bonds, are what define a nation and are what unite us. Not drinking Guinness, not living on the same patch of land with its arbitrarily drawn borders. No, it is our heritage, our inheritance, our blood, our genes, to give it a more modern scientific interpretation, that define us and unite us as an ethnos, as a nation. And I think it was probably not the intended message of that scene, but it certainly can be interpreted that way.
Yeah, it should be said that the Scottish Highlanders, like, they really are Irish, because the Irish invaded Scotland, and it's said that the Irish came from the north of Spain.
Isn't a lot of Scottish Gaelic is also basically just borrowed Irish?
It looks identical almost. You might have some spelling differences.
But I think I think they borrowed it from, like, I think Irish came first, and then it adapted into Scottish Gaelic.
Yeah, no, they're very, very similar. I guess it would be like, I don't know, Spanish and Portuguese. Maybe it's even more similar. I remember reading a book by a Canadian writer who was of Scottish descent, and he was writing about his, the time of his grandparents when they moved over to Nova Scotia or somewhere like that. And they would actually, in the text, he would insert some Scottish Gaelic, and with context, I could more or less figure out what he was saying or what the character was saying. So yeah, it's very, very similar. I think they even used the word Amadan, the Scots pronounce it, which we would say Amadan. They say Amadan.
When right after the scene where we talked about where Wallace kills the English who murdered his wife, and then the other Scottish come into town like, hey, we heard about all this ruckus. We didn't want you Amadans having no fun. Yeah. I like how they threw in some of that. It's good that they did that.
Yeah. It works well. So I'll say as well that the leper, the father of Robert the Bruce, he betrays his own son. He gets the nobles to work with the English, and they arrest Wallace. So I remember watching this as a teenager, and I think most people absolutely hated the father of Robert the Bruce, the leper. We just found him a horrible man. We thought he was very bitter, but as I watch it now, as I say, he's a political animal. He's very, very pragmatic, and his only goal is that there are more Robert the Bruces. 17 Robert the Bruces just aren't enough. We need more in the future. So he's more or less safeguarding his seed, and he more or less gets the kingship for his son. But it's really just like he's an empty figurehead, Robert the Bruce, before that battle, the final battle. Because the English soldiers are looking across, and they say, I hope you kissed your ass, because it's about to be kissed by a king.
Oh, yeah, I hope you washed your ass, because it's about to be kissed by a king. Yeah.
Yeah, so they don't respect him. They realize, yeah, he might be he might look like a king, but he's not really a king. We've just given him a little prize there, So yeah, that's when Robert the Bruce says, you bled with Wallace, now bleed with me, or something like this.
Yeah.
You go into battle. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's what he says, and it's a good moment of redemption for him. I do really think, like, he just really is hard done by this film, poor Robert the Bruce, because he actually is another national hero for Scotland, and they could have, like, he gets a little bit of a redemption at the end, so yeah, that's kind of satisfactory, but poor Robert the Bruce. That's why, again, just to recommend again, if you want to see a good story about Robert the Bruce, a good film adaptation, you can watch Outlaw King. It's very good.
Okay, I'll write that down. I was going to say that the princess, so as Wallace is shouting out his final word, freedom, Longshanks is dying. I think he's had a stroke. He had a stroke, whatever, a few weeks or a few months beforehand. He's lost his powers of speech. He can still hear, and the princess lets him know that, you know, his seed ends with him, because she's been inseminated by the great man William Wallace. And, he can obviously hear this. He can't say anything, but he can hear it.
Embellishment, like, it's just so crazy.
But it's kind of funny. She's more or less initiated her own Primonoctis.
Yeah.
So you know,
what she says is true enough. I mean, Edward II lost everything pretty much that Edward I accomplished, and I don't think he produced any heirs, given the fact that he wasn't. He doesn't play on that sort of team that produces children, let's say. And also, I don't think he even, you know, held his nose and did the job anyway, if I remember correctly. He didn't. Yeah. So the line actually did end, just not the way it's shown in the film, that she gets impregnated by William Wallace.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you know, the camaraderie between the Irish and the Scots. Like, there was a satirical sketch done by Irish TV years ago. I don't know if they're still going, but it was called Après Match. It was during the World Cup tournament and European Championships. And in one of them, you have a kind of a hardcore Irish nationalist, and he's being interviewed, and the interviewer mentions the English, and he corrects the interviewer and says, "Oh no, we don't call them that. We refer to them as them across the water." Yeah. So just a complete hatred of the English, and I think that's unfortunately, when you have an identity built up against hating another tribe, and that's really the core of your identity. When modernity comes around, you're lost at sea, and I think that's what's happened with Irish nationalism.
Yeah,
we said before we came on that there wasn't really a sense of Scottish nationalism until this film came out. It really got Scottish people feeling proud again of their country. But yeah. If you put all your eggs in one basket and you say our culture is about hating this country that's next to us, that's fine. But when
the negative vision,
globalism comes around, you're screwed. You're absolutely screwed. Yeah, go ahead.
I just think it's like that negative vision that we'd mentioned earlier, and just from my observation, from studying Ireland and Irish history, and then also having lots of Irish friends and spending time in Ireland and talking to people, I think that there's this sad. I think it's unfortunate that so much of Irish mentality, and even now it's playing out in the way that Ireland makes certain decisions for itself. It's all based on resentment. It's all based on just, at least we're not England. As long as we're not doing what the English are doing. And any, sort of the hypocrisy is that you get all these Irish people nowadays who will certainly become upright, upstanding Irish nationalists when it comes to being against the English and getting rid of English influence and English control and English power in Ireland. Then they're all nationalists. But these same people, so many of them, just everywhere nowadays, have embraced open borders and multiracialism and multiculturalism to the point now where any Nigerian steps onto the Emerald Isle and says, "I'm from Ireland," and now he's just as Irish as Brian Boru in the eyes of these people. And that's totally fine. They see no hypocrisy in that because their Irish nationalism is only based on being anti-English. So this is a very unfortunate disease of resentment. But then it's another shame because it's not true. It's not the true representation of the Irish spirit. The high Irish spirit, which is based on, heroism and, getting through 800 years of adversity and occupation, never giving up, being brought to the point of genocide on more than one occasion, and you're still here. It's you're still on that island. It's Ireland for the Irish, which is now a dangerous thing to say if you say it in the context of, hey, maybe I don't want all of the third world to come here. But if you say Ireland for the Irish in the context of maybe I don't want the English to be here, then it's okay. So it's a very unfortunate development. I've seen it, I've observed it, I've experienced it. And it's unfortunate because I believe that there is a much higher Irish spirit that is being repressed by this culture of resentment. And I really hope that upstanding people of the Irish nation can get it sorted.
Well, in recent news, and I'm not frothing at the mouth about it, but obviously question marks will be raised because you don't really know. When you're told you're getting something these days, it usually is not what you expect. And there was a video recently, a guy called Philip Dwyer, actually, he filmed himself outside.
I just saw that last night.
Did you see that? Right.
Yeah.
I saw it yesterday, and I have to say kudos to him because it was a great piece of journalism. I didn't see the long video. I'll watch that later. I just saw the short 3.5 minute video or whatever. And these guys, like you were saying how let's say a Nigerian can arrive in Ireland and then immediately say he's Irish, get a pint of Guinness and say I'm Irish and try to speak like an Irishman. We don't, generally white people, okay, we have teenagers now, they try to act like they're blacks, they try to rap, and this is normal. And I could understand when I was a teenager. I remember for example, Tupac Shakur, I like some of his music, etc. But I would never move, let's say, to an African country and say I'm a Nigerian, or I would never move to Jamaica and say I'm a Jamaican. I wouldn't do it. But that's because we have this sense of an honor code that you don't try to claim to be what you're not.
To be honest, most of these non-Europeans who come here, at any given moment, like they're so two-faced. They know they're not of whatever European nation they move to either, because on Monday they'll say, yeah, I'm just as Irish as you. Look at me eating my Tato and drinking my Guinness. But then if you really get into a conversation with them, or if you get into a Twitter argument with them or something like that, they have no problem on a Tuesday being proudly Nigerian, being proudly black, being proudly Pakistani or whatever, and waving the Pakistani flag and holding up their Nigerian or Pakistani culture. They are hypocrites by nature, because all they're doing is just trying to be provocative. So these activists, or these because I don't think that it's most of the migrants themselves are like this. It's just these activist ones, or the ones that just regurgitate activist talking points, are the ones that will say on a Monday, hey, I'm just as Irish as you, or I'm just as French as you, or I was born, in these arbitrary borders, so I'm just as whatever, because I was born on the magic soil that makes me French, that makes me Spanish, that makes me Irish. And then on a Tuesday, you'll catch them saying, Black pride, Black power, Nigerian flag in their Twitter bio, So they know that they're not either, but they just pretend to be provocative.
Look at the Ukrainian situation. So there are actually a lot more blacks in Ukraine than I suspected. And I told you in a previous talk we had that I was there a few years ago for I don't know, 2 weeks or whatever. And I think in all that time I saw 3 black people, and I was walking around the city all day, But obviously a lot has changed in the last number of years, because there are a lot of black people now leaving the Ukraine. And I'm sure that a lot of these, in order to stay in the Ukraine, they would have said, I'm Ukrainian.
Oh wait, no! Did you see that? There's another video that went viral, and I shared.
Oh, I know. Well. I think this is. I'm leading up to this.
Okay, go on.
I'll just go on, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong. So, they would maybe they'd have a child in the country and say, my child is Ukrainian as well. But now, when war breaks out, they're on the border with Poland, and they're telling journalists are saying, hey, you're less than 60 years of age. You're of fighting age. Aren't you going to stay and protect Ukraine? And they immediately say, I am not Ukrainian. Yeah. I'm black. So
He actually
they don't state their
actually breaks
nationality.
into laughter at the preposterous. For him,
yeah, he thinks it's hilarious.
Suddenly the idea is preposterous. It's literally laughable. He breaks into laughter at the idea that he, an African black man, would fight for Ukraine. He actually breaks into laughter, saying, "Why would I fight for Ukraine? I am black. I am not Ukrainian."
But this is the thing as well. Like he says, he doesn't say I'm Ghanaian or I'm Zimbabwean or whatever. He says I'm black. He goes immediately for his race.
Exactly.
It's like this is a white man. This is a white man's war. You know, and okay, let's be honest. I can get it from his perspective. You want to save your skin. He doesn't feel any. Obviously, he doesn't feel any. I
totally understand his perspective. I totally understand. That's why I don't want him in these countries, because they're not of us, and they know it too.
Yeah, he doesn't have any racial solidarity with Ukrainians. Also with Russians, he doesn't. I understand that. But the thing is, when it's not a war, he will. Like there was a clip. You probably saw this as well. This was
in times of peace. If you told that man in times of peace, "Hey, go back to your home country," he would probably say, "This is my country. I was born here." Right?
Exactly.
Or like, "I've got a passport." Like if you look at that the video of Philip Dwyer, right? He's asking these Indians outside the refugee office, like, "What do you mean you're Ukrainian?" And he presses them, and their definition, their justification is, "Well, we're Ukrainian citizens. We're Ukrainian nationals. We've got a passport from Ukraine." Like, because again, they've reduced European identity to a piece of paper. And so in their eyes, it's just, "Oh, well, I've got this document that's from the state, from modern state apparatus, you know, the immigration office, that says that I'm now Ukrainian. So I can now be a Ukrainian refugee. But you're Indian. You're from India. You just said that you're Indian." Yes, but I've got this piece of paper. It's so disrespectful. I hate this more than anything. And it's also why I rail against modernity so much. And I even rail against right-wing concepts of nationalism and the nation state, because I actually think we need to be a lot more tribal about this. And I do this even at my own expense, because I am of mixed ethnicity. So even according to my own concepts, I'm actually kind of playing against myself, because I do think that we need to save our skins, literally, by being very much more tribal about these things and not accepting any notion of civic nationalism, or what I call passport nationalism, at all, because it leads to these types of preposterous situations that everyone recognizes as preposterous. I told you earlier in one of our first conversations that the ideals of liberalism collapse like a house of cards the moment real world realities enter the stage. And I say this as a mixed ethnicity person who would probably, be left without a tribe, or we would have to embark upon a path of creating, an ethnogenesis and devising concepts of new ethnicities, sort of hyphenated ethnicities, like Anglo-Saxon became an ethnicity. So, Italo-Celtic, like me, or Iberian Brit, whatever, because someone has a British mother and a Spanish father, whatever. But we need to get very tribal about this, because it's not good enough to just talk about your nation state, because your nation state is offering citizenship to people. It's offering passports. It's offering residency to people who are now using that to define themselves as one of your tribe. And it's not true, and it doesn't work.
The thing is, the Irish government, they said they would take in, I think originally they said they would take in 10,000 Ukrainian women and children, right?
That number
then it just went up to 100,000, and then over lunch it was like, we'll double that to 200. we'll double that to 200,000.
How many do you think of that 200,000 are actually going to be Ukrainian? Give us a ratio. How many do you think of that 200,000 are going to be genuine Ukrainian?
I would say maybe
Ukrainian refugees.
40% of them, I'd say the minority. Yeah. The minority. Yeah. But imagine this, like I've no problem.
Sorry to interrupt. What I'm saying is that I think that you as an Irishman still would have legitimate complaints, even if all 200,000 were white Ukrainians.
This is what I'm getting
at. Because they are still not of your tribe.
This is what I'm getting at. So what you're doing essentially, because Ireland has such a small population, and it's already less than 80% Irish as far as I know.
Fragile ethnosystem.
it's almost, you know, because even like Wales could very quickly, you know, you could replace the Welsh overnight, more or less.
Exactly. Yep.
And this is what's happening in Ireland. They're doing it so fast now that they can actually bring in, you know, in a matter of weeks, they can bring in the equivalent of 10% of the Irish population and just say, you're now living in Ireland.
And it doesn't matter if they're fellow white-skinned Europeans. It's still changing the culture and the biosphere, exactly, the what I call an ethnosystem, like a play on an ecosystem of Ireland. I don't care if they're fellow Europeans, because yes, Europeans were basically we all descend from basically the same four very ancient tribes of peoples, like sort of prehistoric tribes, and we're all basically related, yes. But over the millennia, we have formed different tribes, different cultures, different ethnos, different nations, and those need to be defended and protected, especially if you take the line that diversity is a good thing, which, by the way, I do. I believe that genuine diversity is something that makes the world beautiful and worth living in. So I don't want the Irish nation to become just a bland country where, you know, white people, I guess, live on it, but are they really Celtic? Are they really Irish? No, they're Slavic. They are Mediterranean. They're Germanic. It still wouldn't be the same. And of course, I even more object to the idea that you can flood this small island nation with people from entirely different racial groups. It would be bad enough if they were coming from other European nation groups, but the fact that they're not coming from entirely different racial groups is even more of a. I think it is a sin. I'll put it that way. It is a sin. It is an affront to God or the gods or whatever you want to believe in, the natural order, whatever you want to call it. It is that, to me, it is that egregious.
How it began really was around the turn of the millennium. Poles and Slovaks and Czechs started coming in, and there were no real problems. We knew they were different. But then you would start seeing, for example, supplements in newspapers that were in Polish, things like that. You know, subtle changes. But I think generally there wasn't a big hullabaloo about it, really, because
no, I've got
they're European, they're Catholic, whatever. But yeah, you can see this across all European countries that what they want is they want to replace the native population with non-whites. That's the general plan.
Everyone. They want everyone to be deracinated, to be cut adrift, to just become coffee-colored consumers with no. Because look at again, going back to Braveheart, even though it's fiction, that speech, but look what it caused. The moment William Wallace appealed to blood and soil, the soldiers stayed and fought. This is a fictional representation of a fundamental truth that has been true for all time, and the ruling class knows it. The brackets people know this, that if you can deracinate people and if you can surgically remove something from their spirit, something from their soul, which is that connection to blood and soil and kinship and the tribe, the clan, then you are left with nothing more than a malleable biomass of tax cattle and consumers, which is what we are approaching. And this also gets a lot deeper into sort of Judaic eschatology, end of world, end times prophecies. There's people who believe that it is their divine destiny to rule over a race of sort of homogenized cattle. And that is what we're up against. We can never forget this.
Revolution, rebellion, whatever it be. The reason for it is because you are not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for the memory of your ancestors. And when that has been severed, when you have no sense of blood, of no sense of, as you say, kinship. Let's say your parents were migrants, they moved to this country, 20 years ago, and now you're 16 or 17. You don't have any real link. You have a material link to the country, but you don't have an
This is what
ancestral
happens to Americans.
As you
This
say,
is why
blood and soil.
this is what happens to this is what happened to me in America, and this is what I see happening to America, and this is why I don't want the American model to be what Europe becomes. Because many Americans now, what does it mean to be an American? Why is America so demoralized? America is now performing abysmally in the Olympics, and nobody cares. That would have never happened even, 30 years ago. Nobody cares because nobody is an American anymore. There is no America to cheer for. And, the all-black United States gymnastics team doesn't represent the vast majority, still to this day, the majority of the American people. So nobody cares. And nobody unites behind this, bitchy black gymnast who's, privileged and posh and whiny and, withdraws because she needs to center herself or whatever. That's not a uniting heroic figure anymore. That's not an Aryan spirit manifesting itself through sport. So you see, this is the demoralization that happens when you have these deracinated, one world type societies. And I think also, people get upset, people are getting demoralized even on our side, it's not even my nation is not even worth defending or fighting for, especially after the last 2 years of COVID and the way people behaved. I can understand that. I feel the same, at this point. No, I don't consider myself fighting for the quote unquote white race, or this society. I would actually like to get as far away from it and independent of this society as possible. But like I said, like before, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is still good in this world, and there's still good in the peoples of Europe that is worth fighting for and worth standing up for and worth advocating for. And there is still good in the idea of a diverse world. And I think people who have traveled can relate to this. Travel the world now, it isn't really worth it. Go anywhere. Go anywhere in Europe, for example, and all the big cities are the same. You will find the same multinational corporations, the same fast food franchises, the same music playing everywhere, the same pop culture, the same series on the television. People will be, watching, spending their weekend in the same manner at home, watching Netflix, in all sorts of countries which used to be very different. There would be such a change, even in the air you breathe. The smell of the air you breathe could be different from going from one country to another. Now it's all very samey, and I know from experience that it's all very samey, and it's very underwhelming and disappointing to experience that, where you have these great expectations of seeing the world and seeing different cultures, and really apart from learning a different language and eating eating some different kinds of cuisine, most of the day-to-day has become very similar. And even it's what really annoys me, what really bothers me, is that we're even seeing behavior. We've been talking about the differences of behavior in like the Celtic peoples in comparison to the Anglo-Saxons or the Normans, etc. I'm seeing now people are behaving very similarly all over the world. We're all just behaving like one gray biomass. And I find this really horrific. I think people don't realize the gravity of what we are losing on the altar, what we are sacrificing on the altar of modernity and convenience and global governance and all this crap that we think we need, that we think is so essential, or even if we disagree with it, that what the ruling class is imposing upon us. I think people really need to never forget just how against the natural order this really is.
I just say as well that people have this idea that the globalist tyrants, the globalist so-called leaders, whatever, that they're kind of like the Borg, and they just take over everything, and they grind it down, and they all have the one will behind it to achieve their ends. And this is kind of what's happened. A lot of people think of it this way. I would say that the people at the very top, they're like a pack of wolves. If you think of wolves, they are generally independent, but when it comes to hunting, they will gather and whatever. But there's a lot going on there. They're not just one cohesive group. They're at each other's throats all the time. There's a pecking order that changes,
Oh, sure.
etc. So what's going to happen in the world? The people at the top, and it looks like it's starting to happen now. They don't want to share. They don't want to share the resources of the world. They're starting to bicker. They're starting to say, well, you know what? I want it all for myself. And then someone else says, well, actually, I want it all for myself. And this is what's beginning to happen. We're seeing this. So the winds of change are about us. Obviously,
Yeah.
It never fares well for a lot of people when these tyrants start bickering. But in the long term, I believe it brings back a little bit of tradition and a bit of stability. Because
well, yeah, I mean, if you look at historically the collapse of empires, whenever an empire collapses, usually there's a bit of a shrinking that happens, and in that shrinkage arises either an ethnogenesis or the repressed nations return. So, you know, we see this with the fall of the Roman Empire. What happened? The rise of the European nations. So I hope that can happen. It's just the modern world behaves in a very different way. Technology has changed things so much. There's some things, like I said earlier, like that not much is new under the sun. What is new is the way that the modern world behaves in contrast to most of human history. And I do think that, you know, there might be some things that don't go as we would expect to go historically. And I think it's a good point you make about the ruling class fighting amongst itself. This is something that, you know, people like Keith Woods, I suppose, and others like him who sort of frowned upon anyone who was looking at the agenda behind COVID and the agenda behind the Great Reset and the motives of things like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and the power they wield. Well, he derides it all as, you know, conspiracy theories and conspiratards and all that sort of thing. And he will give examples of like, well, if the World Economic Forum is controlling everything, then how come or if the UN is controlling everything, then how come there's this, you know, example of infighting amongst it? Or how come Putin is doing this if he's a World Economic Forum member, etc. And I think this fails. It's a failure on people like Keith Wood's part, or people like him. You know, I'm using him as an example of things that he said in the past. I think it's a failure of them to understand that in the pyramid of power, those at the top are also jockeying for a higher position. This has always been the case. The ruling class, the ruling elites also fight amongst themselves for higher positions and for their own interests, which sometimes are shared and sometimes are at odds. So I don't think it's any surprise that I don't think it sort of debunks quote unquote conspiracy perspectives that the ruling class would infight amongst itself. Of course they do, and they always have done, and they always will.
I agree. So I will quote the final narration from William Wallace. I would like to thank Pox Populi for coming on, and I will leave you, Pox Populi, with the final word once I have read in a poorly attempted Scottish accent the following words. In the year of our Lord, 1314, patriots of Scotland, starving and outnumbered, charged the fields of Bannockburn. They fought like warrior poets. They fought like Scotsmen and won back their freedom.
I think that was actually a very good Scottish accent. So, final word, I would say that the film Braveheart is a great epic. It's a great example of technical skill, cinematic skill. It can be a bit over the top for current year sensibilities. It is historically inaccurate, but I think the film is full of values that should and can resonate with people in our little thing, people in our sphere, traditionalists, dissidents, anyone who is opposed to what is going on, what we see going on nowadays, and that's the negative vision. But then also values of people who have a positive vision of, you know, kinship and building something from the ashes of what we're living in now. So I think that Braveheart stands the test of time. It will always stand the test of time. I think it's a film worth watching, and especially if you are of Irish or Scottish or Welsh descent, even, I think it can appeal to all of those nations. It has universal appeal, but I do think it has a particular appeal to people of those nations. And I will continue recommending it to anyone. And I've really enjoyed having the chance to have a 3-hour-long conversation about this film with the wonderful German pointer. So thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you all next time.